Hey friends! Glad you're here at Gringotts Hub. We've cooked up something special. What if Harry claimed the Gryffindor-Slytherin-Peverell-Merlin Lordships and stripped the Wizengamot of all power? Liking and subscribing really helps us out. Okay, story time. Chapter 1, The Reading of Names. The letter from Gringotts arrived on a Tuesday, which Harry thought was an unremarkable day for everything to change. He'd been sitting at the narrow desk in his room at number 4, Privet Drive, pretending to do homework while actually staring at the wall and thinking about Sirius. That was most of what he did these days, stare at things and think about Sirius. The guilt sat in his chest like a stone he couldn't put down, and he'd stopped trying to put it down. It was just part of him now, like his scar, like his glasses, like the particular exhaustion that came from being Harry Potter. Hedwig dropped the letter on his transfiguration essay at 9:30 in the morning, hooted once with an air of professional detachment, and went immediately to her water dish. The envelope was thick cream parchment, sealed with a wax impression of a goblin's profile rendered in burnished gold. The words Gringotts Wizarding Bank, Office of Inheritance and Estate were embossed across the front in letters that caught the light and seemed faintly warm to the touch. Harry turned it over, broke the seal, and read. Mr. H. J. Potter, you are hereby formally notified that a full inheritance right has been triggered on your account following the death of your godfather, Sirius Orion Black, and the subsequent legal reversion of the Black estate. In processing this transfer, our curse breakers discovered significant irregularities in your existing inheritance files, irregularities that suggest your full magical and legal inheritance has never been formally assessed or claimed. Gringotts requests your presence at your earliest convenience for a comprehensive inheritance reading. The reading will assess all bloodline claims, dormant lordships, sealed vaults, and any magical inheritances or abilities that have been blocked, suppressed, or otherwise prevented from manifesting. We stress that this reading is time-sensitive. Several of the estates in question have clauses that void automatically if not claimed by the heir's 17th birthday. Your account manager, Ragnok, will attend personally. Gringotts Wizarding Bank. Harry read it twice. Then he folded it carefully, tucked it into his back pocket, and went downstairs to tell the Dursleys he needed to go to London. The argument that followed was brief, because Harry had stopped caring what the Dursleys thought approximately 2 weeks ago, and something in his face must have communicated that shift, because Uncle Vernon turned an interesting shade of purple, said nothing that amounted to a real objection, and sat back down at the kitchen table. Aunt Petunia pretended to be very busy with the washing up. Dudley was already gone, which was the natural state of things. Harry wrote 2 letters, one to Dumbledore explaining briefly that he had business at Gringotts, and one to Ron and Hermione saying the same. He didn't ask permission. He informed. Then he called the night bus. It was a different London in summer, full of tourists and heat and the particular chaos of the city trying to contain too many people at once. Harry walked through it with his hood up and his head down, not because he was afraid, but because he didn't particularly want to talk to anyone before he understood what he was walking into. He bought a coffee from a cart near the leaky cauldron, black, too hot, slightly bitter, and drank it standing up, watching the street. Then he went through the pub, through the wall, and into Diagon Alley. Gringotts at 10 in the morning was busy in the methodical, unhurried way of institutions that had been conducting business for longer than most governments had existed. Goblins moved between counters with the focused efficiency of people who had no patience for inefficiency. The chandeliers threw cold white light across marble floors. The scale of it, the height of the ceilings, the depth of the teller counters, the sheer weight of stone and gold and accumulated centuries, never quite stopped being impressive, no matter how many times Harry had been here. He approached the nearest teller. Harry Potter. I have an appointment with Ragnok. The goblin looked up at him with amber eyes that held the particular expression of someone who had seen everything twice and was mildly curious about this particular iteration. Identification. Harry pressed his thumb to the offered crystal, which glowed briefly gold. The goblin examined it, nodded once, and gestured to a younger goblin standing near the far wall. Grip hook will take you. It was a different grip hook than Harry remembered from first year, or possibly the same one, he couldn't be certain, who led him not down into the vaults but up a set of stairs Harry had never noticed before, carved into the back wall of the main hall and partially concealed behind a tapestry depicting a goblin rebellion in enormous and enthusiastic detail. The stairs wound upward for 3 full floors before opening into a corridor of dark wood and deep green carpet, lined with doors that had no visible handles. Griphook stopped at the 3rd door on the left, pressed his hand flat against the wood, and stepped back as it swung open. "Ragnok will join you shortly." The room was not what Harry expected. He'd imagined something small and transactional, the magical equivalent of a bank manager's office. Instead it was a chamber that took up most of the floor, with a ceiling lost in shadow and walls lined with shelves of carved stone tablets, each one engraved in runes so small they were barely visible from a distance. At the center of the room was a large circular table of black stone, inlaid with what looked like a star chart in silver. Several chairs surrounded it, high-backed and serious. On the table, already laid out with the precision of someone who had prepared carefully, were 4 folders of thick parchment, a crystal basin filled with something that shifted between silver and gold, a quill, and a small knife with a bone handle. Harry sat down and waited. He was good at waiting. He'd had a lot of practice. Ragnok arrived 3 minutes later, and Harry's first impression was of someone very old and very sharp, the two qualities combined in the way they sometimes do in people who have survived long enough to stop pretending. The goblin was smaller than most of his counterparts, his face deeply lined, his eyes the color of old iron. He moved without hurry but also without waste, settling into the chair directly across from Harry and folding his hands on the table with the air of someone about to say something they'd been thinking about for a while. "Mr. Potter." His voice was like gravel being carefully sorted. "Thank you for coming promptly. I half expected Dumbledore's people to intercept this letter." Harry looked at him steadily. "Did you think they would? Previous letters were intercepted. This one was sent through channels they don't monitor." Ragnok tilted his head very slightly. "Gringotts does not appreciate interference in inheritance proceedings. We have tolerated certain oversights regarding your account for some years. We are done tolerating them." Something cold settled in Harry's stomach, but he kept his voice level. "What kind of oversights?" "We'll come to that." Ragnok opened the first folder. "First, I need to explain what an inheritance reading is, for those who have never had one. Please. Magic is not simply a skill or a talent. It is also a lineage. Ancient magical families, those with documented history stretching back 5 centuries or more, accumulate magical essence in their bloodlines. This essence grants certain abilities, certain affinities, certain rights. When a family line is sufficiently ancient and powerful, that essence can also manifest as what wizards call a lordship, a formal magical acknowledgement that the head of that bloodline holds a particular authority." Ragnok paused. "Most wizards with lordship claims never know they have them. The claims go dormant. The estates molder. The magic dissipates, eventually. But mine haven't. No. Yours have not." Ragnok gestured at the crystal basin. "The reading works as follows. You contribute a single drop of blood to the basin. The basin assesses your full bloodline, every line, every connection, however distant, however dormant. What emerges will be your complete magical inheritance. Every vault you're entitled to. Every title. Every property. Every suppressed ability." He paused again, and this time there was something in his expression that might have been, in a goblin, the equivalent of anticipation. "I have been conducting inheritance readings for 63 years, Mr. Potter. I want you to understand that before we begin." "Okay," Harry said. "In 63 years, I have never personally attended a reading for a client below the age of 50. I attend the readings of the most significant inheritances that pass through this institution. I attended the readings of the last 4 ministers for magic, the readings of the heads of the Sacred 28, and the reading that confirmed the Dumbledore family's assets following the death of the headmaster's mother." Ragnok looked at him directly. I am attending yours because when our curse breakers filed their preliminary report, I pulled your file myself and I have been personally managing it since. Harry looked at the folders on the table. How many lines are there? We'll see. That's rather the point of the reading. Ragnok pushed the small knife toward him. A single drop. In the center of the basin. Harry picked up the knife. It was lighter than it looked, the bone handle warm and slightly textured. He pressed the tip to the pad of his index finger, made a small cut, and held his hand over the basin until a single dark red drop fell into the silver-gold liquid. The effect was immediate and dramatic in the way of things that have been waiting for a very long time. The liquid in the basin went absolutely still for half a second, and then erupted upward in a column of light that hit the ceiling and spread, like sunrise and fast forward, illuminating every rune on every stone tablet along the walls. The light was warm at first, gold and red in the Gryffindor colors Harry had grown up with, and then it shifted, bleeding into a deep silver green that he recognized somewhere below conscious thought, and then further, into something older and darker and more complex, a blue-white light that had the quality of lightning seen from a distance, powerful and clean. The column of light hung in the air above the basin for a long moment, and then it resolved itself into words. Not floating letters, the words were formed in the light itself, as though the magic was writing in its own language and translating as it went. Ragnok leaned forward and read. Then he sat back in his chair and was quiet for a long moment. Well, he said finally. And for the first time, his voice held something that was unmistakably genuine surprise. Well. Harry looked at the words still hanging in the light above the basin and read them himself. It took him a moment because some of the script was archaic, the letters slightly unfamiliar, but the meaning resolved itself with a clarity that felt almost physical. Heir and Lord of the most ancient and noble house of Potter. Heir and Lord of the most ancient and noble house of Black, by right of godson inheritance and blood adoption partial claim. Heir and Lord of the most ancient and noble house of Gryffindor, senior bloodline, direct descent through maternal line, Evans, formerly Eoforwine, formerly Griffinwine. Heir and Lord of the most ancient and noble house of Slytherin, senior bloodline, direct descent through paternal line, Potter, formerly Peverell Junior branch. Heir and Lord of the most ancient and noble house of Peverell, senior bloodline, primary heir, all three brothers' lines converge. Heir and Lord of the most ancient and arcane house of Emrys, called Merlin, magical essence inheritance only, no blood descendants, full magical transfer to primary bloodline heir. The light faded. The room was very quiet. Harry sat with his hands flat on the table and breathed in and breathed out and said nothing for a while, because some information needs to settle before you can respond to it intelligently. Ragnok watched him with those iron-colored eyes and waited. Merlin, Harry said at last. Not a question exactly. Merlin had no descendants. He had, however, documented his magical essence in a series of artifacts and tablets, the last of which contains a transfer clause. Ragnok pulled the second folder toward him and opened it. The clause stipulates that his full magical inheritance, not a fraction, not a portion, but the complete accumulated essence of Merlin Emrys' power, passes to the single living wizard who represents the convergence of the four greatest magical bloodlines of British wizarding history. Those four bloodlines being Gryffindor, Slytherin, Peverell, and the line of Arthur Pendragon. He paused. You don't have Pendragon blood. However, the clause was written with an amendment: if no Pendragon heir exists at the time of the convergence, the Emrys' inheritance passes unconditionally. There are no Pendragon descendants. None that we've been able to locate in 800 years of looking. Ragnok almost smiled. Gringotts has been looking. We have financial interests in the resolution of this claim. Harry let that sit for a moment. The Gryffindor line. My mother's side. The Evans family name was an anglicization, adopted sometime in the 17th century. Before that, the family used the name Eoforwine, which is itself a corruption of Griffinwine, a name that appears in our oldest records as a junior branch of the Gryffindor family that chose a quieter life outside the wizarding world. Ragnok tapped the relevant page in the folder. Your mother, Lily Evans Potter, was a muggle-born in the sense that she was raised outside wizarding society. She was not, however, without magical lineage. The magic had simply been dormant in her family for generations, waiting for someone capable of expressing it fully. And Slytherin through my father. Harry frowned. Dad's family was Peverell descendants. The Potter family descends from the younger Peverell brothers, Cadmus and Ignotus. Your direct ancestor Linfred of Stinchcombe, known in your family's records as the Potter, was a grandson of Ignotus Peverell. The Peverell line has a documented ancestral connection to Slytherin's bloodline through Slytherin's younger sister, whose descendants married into the Peverell family in the 12th century. Ragnok closed the folder. The point is not the genealogy, Mr. Potter, fascinating as it is. The point is that you are, as of this moment, the last senior heir of 4 of the most powerful magical dynasties in British history, and the sole inheritor of Merlin's magical legacy. All of it. Simultaneously. Harry looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then back at Ragnok. You said there were irregularities in my account. The goblin's expression shifted into something harder. Yes. There were. He pulled the third folder forward, and this one was thicker than the others, pages and pages of close-written records and what looked like curse analysis reports. When we began reviewing your file in preparation for this reading, our cursebreakers identified several active enchantments on your person and your accounts that had no authorization from you or any legally recognized guardian. What kind of enchantments? 3 distinct magical suppressors. 1 keyed to your Slytherin bloodline, which would have prevented the full expression of your Parseltongue ability and certain other Slytherin-descended talents. 1 keyed to your Peverell bloodline, which suppressed your natural affinity for death magic, which manifests in Peverell descendants as an immunity to certain classes of curse and an unusual relationship with the Deathly Hallows. Ragnok paused. And 1 keyed to your Gryffindor bloodline, which suppressed your full magical capacity. Without it, our assessment suggests your raw magical power would be, conservatively, 3 to 4 times what you currently express. The room was very quiet again. Who put them there? Harry asked. His voice came out even, which he thought was impressive given what was happening underneath it. We cannot say with certainty. They were placed when you were approximately 15 months old. They are extremely sophisticated workings, not the kind of magic your average wizard could produce. They show evidence of multiple casters working in concert. Ragnok looked at him directly. We have removed them. It took our best cursebreakers 6 days. You may notice some adjustment in the coming hours. Harry became suddenly aware that the warmth he'd been half noticing since he sat down in this room wasn't the room's temperature. It was coming from somewhere inside him. A low, deep warmth like a furnace that had been banked for years and was now, very slowly, coming back to full fire. His scar pulsed once, not with pain, but with something more complex, like a door swinging open. Okay, he said again, because it was the only word that seemed proportionate. The 4th folder, Ragnok said, contains the inventory of your full estate. I'll give you the summary. In addition to your existing Potter vault, you now have access to the Black family vault and properties, including Grimmauld Place and 7 other properties across Britain and Ireland. The Gryffindor vault contains assets accumulated over 11 centuries and is, conservatively, the 4th largest single account currently held in Gringotts. The Slytherin vault is larger, it is the 2nd largest. The Peverell vault contains primarily artifacts rather than gold, but the artifacts are of incalculable magical value. And the Emery's estate, Ragnok paused for effect, or possibly because he needed a moment himself, the Emery's estate includes Avalon. Harry blinked. I'm sorry. The island. The property. The actual magical location. Ragnok's expression was perfectly composed. It has been sitting in trust for 800 years waiting for the convergence heir. Gringotts has been maintaining it. We will expect reimbursement for 800 years of property management, naturally. Naturally, Harry said faintly. The total value of your consolidated estate, in galleons, runs to a figure that would require us to restructure how Gringotts categorizes its account tiers. Ragnok closed the fourth folder. You are, as of today, the wealthiest individual in Wizarding Britain. The wealthiest individual, to our knowledge, in Wizarding Europe. Possibly the wealthiest individual in the documented history of Wizarding civilization. Harry sat with that for a moment. Outside, through the thick stone walls, he could faintly hear the ordinary sounds of Diagon Alley going about its ordinary Tuesday business, completely unaware that anything had changed. The Lordships, Harry said. The 4 seats on the Wizengamot. Ragnok's eyes sharpened. He'd been waiting for this. Yes. What does claiming them actually mean? Politically. Practically. Ragnok leaned forward slightly. Each of the 4 ancient lordships carries a Wizengamot seat with voting rights. The Gryffindor and Slytherin seats, as 2 of the original 5 founding houses of the Hogwarts Charter, carry double-weighted votes in matters pertaining to magical education and the governance of magical minors. The Peverell seat carries triple-weighted votes in matters pertaining to the use and regulation of death magic, which includes unforgivables, Horcrux legislation, and necromantic law. The Emery's seat, he paused, has never been filled. It was created by Merlin himself as a seat that supersedes all others. In the event that the Emery's heir is present at a Wizengamot session, all other votes require the Emery's heir's endorsement to pass. It is, in essence, an absolute veto over all Wizengamot proceedings. The warmth inside Harry's chest was stronger now. He could feel the magic moving differently through him, not uncomfortably, but decisively, like water finding channels that had always been there. All 4 seats are currently vacant, Harry said. All 4 seats have been vacant for a very long time. The Gryffindor seat has been empty since the 12th century. The Slytherin seat since the mid-18th century, when the last known Slytherin line descendant, before your reading, died without a confirmed heir. The Peverell seat has technically been held by the Dumbledore family as a caretaker, as Albus Dumbledore has a very distant Peverell connection, but his claim is so attenuated as to be essentially ceremonial, and it voids entirely the moment a primary heir presents. Ragnok held his gaze. Dumbledore loses his Peverell caretaker seat the moment you claim yours. Harry thought about what that meant. He thought about what Dumbledore had done, not out of cruelty, he was nearly sure, but out of that particular kind of careful management that treated other people as pieces on a board rather than players. He thought about being told to go back to the Dursleys every summer. He thought about Sirius, who'd spent 12 years in Azkaban while people who could have helped him hadn't. He thought about the prophecy that he'd only learned about because it had cost Sirius his life to keep it secret. He thought about the letter that had apparently not been the first letter Gringotts had tried to send him. I want to claim all 4 lordships today, Harry said. Ragnok produced a ring box from somewhere, it appeared on the table as though it had been waiting for this exact moment, which it probably had, and opened it. Inside were 4 rings, each clearly ancient, each radiating a quality of presence that made the air around them feel slightly denser. The Gryffindor ring was gold with a lion in relief, its eyes set with tiny rubies that caught the light and seemed to move. The Slytherin ring was silver with a serpent coiled around the band, a single emerald at its center. The Peverell ring was black stone, not the resurrection stone, Harry noted with relief, that stone was gone, mounted in a simple band that managed to look, simultaneously, very old and very permanent. The Merlin ring was unlike the others, it was made of something that wasn't quite any metal Harry could name, shifting between silver and gold and something closer to white depending on the light, set with what appeared to be a piece of a star. They resize, Ragnok said. They will also indicate if you are the legitimate heir, a false claimant will find them unresponsive at best and actively hostile at worst. The Emery's ring, particularly, has been known to injure fraudulent claimants. Harry looked at the rings for a moment. Then he reached out, picked up the Gryffindor ring, and put it on his right index finger. It fit immediately, tightening slightly as though settling into place. He felt it, a click of recognition that was entirely magical, deep in his chest, like a key turning in a lock he hadn't known was there. The lion's eyes flashed once, brilliantly, and then the ring sat still and warm on his hand and simply was. He put on the Slytherin ring next, right middle finger. It was colder than the Gryffindor ring, but not hostile, more like the cold of deep water, powerful and old. The serpent coiled slightly, as though breathing, and was still. The Peverell ring went on his right ring finger. As it settled, he felt the suppressor that Ragnok's curse breakers had already removed, felt the absence of it, the open space where it had been, and from that space something rose quietly, like smoke from a fire that had been smothered for years and was finally, unhurriedly, beginning to breathe. The world looked slightly different with the Peverell ring on. Not different enough to describe precisely, but different in the way that putting on glasses for the first time feels different, like something has finally resolved into its proper shape. Then he picked up the Emry's ring. The moment his fingers closed around it, the temperature in the room dropped by several degrees, and every candle flared simultaneously to twice its normal size. The light from the ring blazed between his fingers like sunlight through a cracked door, and Harry felt something that he could only describe afterward as an enormous door swinging open, not in the room, but in himself, in the deep structural architecture of who and what he was. The magic that had been warming in him since the suppressors were lifted surged like a tide coming in, and he gripped the ring tightly and breathed through it and felt it resolve, felt the vast cool clarity of power that had always been there, waiting. He put it on his right little finger. It fit. Of course it fit. Ragnok had gone absolutely still across the table, and his iron eyes were very wide. "Are you all right?" Harry asked. "The Emry's ring," Ragnok said quietly, "has not been worn by anyone in 8 centuries. When it activated for you, our curse breakers 2 floors down reported that every active suppression ward in the building temporarily intensified by 40%. He paused. From the sympathetic discharge of the ring confirming its heir. That is how much power was in that confirmation pulse. Harry looked at his right hand. 4 rings, warm and settled and right, and the magic moving through him like a river that had found its proper course after years of being dammed. "I'll need stationery," he said. "With all 4 house crests and the Emry's seal. And a list of every active member of the Wizengamot, their holdings, their voting records for the past 10 years, and any documented connections to Death Eater activity." Ragnok, for the first time in 63 years of inheritance readings, looked genuinely delighted. "I'll have Griphook bring it immediately." He stood, and then he did something Harry had never seen a goblin do. He inclined his head, deeply and deliberately, in a gesture that was clearly not a bow but was something close, something that carried respect rather than ceremony. "Lord Potter Gryffindor-Slytherin-Peverell-Merlin. It is an honor." Harry looked at him for a moment and then nodded back with the same deliberateness. "Ragnok. Thank you for the letter. Thank you for coming promptly." Griphook arrived with the stationery and documents within 10 minutes, along with a pot of tea that Harry hadn't asked for but was extremely grateful for, and a plate of something that turned out to be an excellent shortbread biscuit which he ate 3 of while reading through the Wizengamot voting records. The records were damning. Not in a subtle way, in the way of people who had never expected anyone to actually read them carefully. 14 members of the Wizengamot had voted against every proposed investigation of Death Eater activity during Voldemort's first rise. 9 of those 14 had voted to release the same Death Eaters from Azkaban within 3 years of his defeat. 7 of those 9 had voted for Dolores Umbridge's educational decree authority at Hogwarts. 3 of those 7 had contributed financially to the legal defense of Lucius Malfoy following his initial arrest in 1981. Harry circled those 3 names with a dark green quill and then sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling and began thinking. The thinking took about 20 minutes. When he was done thinking, he had a structure, not a complete plan, but the skeleton of one, the bones of something that could become a plan given the right people and the right information. He wrote 3 letters. The first was to Hermione, because Hermione could research anything and would be the one to find the legal mechanisms he'd need. The second was to Neville, because something about the Wizengamot voting records made him think of the Longbottoms in St. Mungo's, and Neville deserved to be in on this from the beginning. The third was to Amelia Bones, whose voting record was the cleanest in the pile, every vote in favor of investigation, every vote against releasing Death Eaters without proper trial, a consistent record of doing her job with integrity when almost everyone around her was doing the opposite. He did not write to Dumbledore. He thought about it for a long time and decided not to, and the decision felt like setting down something heavy that he'd been carrying for a very long time. He'd tell Dumbledore in person. Face to face, where neither of them could edit themselves into something they weren't. He sealed the letters, handed them to Griphook to be dispatched by Gringotts Owl, faster and more secure than the regular post, and then read through the rest of the documents while the afternoon light moved across the window and Ragnok brought in 2 more goblins to help begin processing the estate transfers. It was past 4 o'clock when Harry finally stood up, rolled the various documents into a satchel that Ragnok had provided, shrugged on his jacket, and headed for the door. He paused at the threshold. "The Black Estate," he said. "Grimmauld Place. The Order of the Phoenix is using it as headquarters." "We're aware," Ragnok said. "They can continue to use it. But the wards are mine now, and I'm going to change them." He thought for a moment. "Can you arrange for a ward specialist to meet me there tomorrow morning? At 9. 9 is fine." He walked back through the corridor of dark wood and green carpet, down the stairs behind the tapestry, and out into the main hall of Gringotts. The afternoon rush was in full swing, and no one looked at him as he crossed the marble floor toward the doors. Just another young wizard in a hoodie, moving with calm purpose through the institution. Except that the rings on his right hand had, between the warmth of Gryffindor and the cold precision of Slytherin and the deep immovability of Peverell and the blazing clarity of Emery's, begun to feel less like jewelry and more like something structural. Like they'd always been part of the architecture of him and had simply been waiting to be claimed. The doors opened onto Diagon Alley. The sun was still out, it had been an unremarkable summer afternoon, going about its business. Harry stepped out into it, and for a moment just stood at the top of the broad white steps and looked at the street. Ollivanders, closed since the attack. Florian Fortescue's, also closed, Florian himself gone and no one talking about it. The Daily Prophet's board with today's headline visible from here, Minister affirms stability despite persistent Dementor reports. A pair of Aurors standing outside the magical menagerie looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. A group of Hogwarts-age students moving in the anxious cluster that had become the default formation of people who knew that safety now required numbers. He'd walked into this bank as a 16-year-old boy who was famous for something that had happened when he was a baby. He walked out of it as something else entirely. He didn't feel different in the way he'd expected, not powerful in the dramatic, lightning from fingertips way that the word power usually suggested. He felt different in the way that someone who has been walking slightly crooked their whole life and then someone adjusts their spine feels different, suddenly upright, suddenly aware of the correct alignment of things, suddenly capable of carrying weight that had previously been impossible. He walked down the steps and into the street, and the afternoon went on around him, and inside his chest the magic burned clean and steady and complete, and somewhere in the structure of Wizarding Britain, 4 ancient lordship seats had filled with living magic for the first time in centuries, and the ripple of it was already, very quietly, beginning to move. Harry bought another coffee from the cart near the leaky cauldron. Drank it on the street. Watched the people go past. Then he took out a fresh piece of parchment from the satchel, borrowed the cart vendor's pen, a biro, not a quill, which felt appropriate, and began writing the outline of what he intended to do next. It was a long list. He didn't rush it. He had time, and he was, for the first time in his life, working from a position of actual power rather than desperate improvisation. When he was done, he looked at the list, folded it, pocketed it, and said quietly, to nobody in particular, to the street and the summer air and the busy ordinary Tuesday afternoon, right. Let's see how they like this. The city moved around him, indifferent and alive, and Harry Potter walked back through the leaky cauldron with 4 lordships on his right hand and the magic of Merlin moving through his blood like something that had been waiting a very, very long time to finally come home. Chapter 2, The Weight of Stone. The dreams were different now. Before, when Harry dreamed, he dreamed in Voldemort's voice, cold corridors, the smell of snake and dark magic, flashes of other people's pain seen through borrowed eyes. He'd grown almost used to it the way you grow used to a bad neighborhood, alert, never quite comfortable, always expecting something to come at you from the wrong direction. The night after Gringotts, he dreamed of water. Not the terrifying black water of the second task or the churning lake at the edge of the Hogwarts grounds. Deep, still water, lit from somewhere below by light that was neither gold nor silver but some older color that didn't have a name in any language Harry spoke. He stood in it up to his waist and it was neither warm nor cold and he wasn't afraid. The rings on his right hand caught the unnamed light and threw it back in 4 distinct colors simultaneously, and somewhere very far below the surface something vast and patient stirred, recognized him, and went back to sleep. He woke at 6 in the morning feeling more rested than he had in a year. Hedwig was watching him from her perch with the skeptical interest of someone who's noticed a significant change in a person they know well. Harry scratched under her beak, dressed quickly in the grey early light, and was out of Privet Drive before the Dursleys' alarm went off. The ward specialist from Gringotts was already waiting outside number 12, Grimmauld Place when Harry arrived at 9. Her name was Braxthorne, and she was the first female goblin Harry had ever met, not that he'd thought about it, but the difference in Gringotts' workforce distribution was notable. She was compact and precise, carried a leather case that clinked softly with every step, and looked at the exterior of Grimmauld Place with the professional assessment of someone deciding how much work they're actually looking at. Original blacks put these wards down in 1834, she said, not looking at Harry. Layered on top of something older. Something considerably older. Now she did look at him. Some of the sub-foundation wards read Slytherin era. Your Slytherin bloodline recognition is probably why the Fidelius was keyed to you as the new secret keeper without anyone having to do the formal transfer. Sirius made me secret keeper before he died. Harry hadn't known that. The property recognized you as his heir and defaulted to you automatically when he passed. The Fidelius followed the property's magical recognition. She opened her case and took out what looked like a compass made of bone and amber. Any specific changes you want, or should I just assess first? Assess first. But I want to know about anything that might be compromising the security of the people inside. She nodded briskly and got to work, moving around the exterior of the house with the compass and a piece of chalk, making small marks on the pavement and the lower stones of the building that Harry suspected nobody else would be able to see. He stood on the pavement and watched the street and let her work. The order found out he was there at approximately 9:30, when Mrs. Weasley came barreling out the front door in her dressing gown with the expression of someone who'd been told simultaneously that there was a fire, a gas leak, and an unexpected guest. Harry. What on earth, why didn't you tell anyone you were coming? Dumbledore said, there are protocols. Good morning, Mrs. Weasley. Harry hugged her, because she looked like she needed it and because he was genuinely fond of her even when she was treating him like a package that had arrived without tracking information. I'm fine. I had business in London yesterday and I'm here to sort out the wards this morning. Can I come in for tea? She looked at Braxthorne, who ignored her with complete professional detachment. Who is that? Ward specialist from Gringotts. She's checking the foundations. Harry stepped toward the door. Tea. The kitchen was full in the way the Grimmauld Place kitchen was always full during order meetings, too many people, not enough chairs, the particular charged atmosphere of people who'd been having the same arguments for months. Remus Lupin was at the table with Tonks, both of them with tea that looked like it had been poured a while ago. Mad-Eye Moody was in the corner by the window, watching Harry with his magical eye in a way that felt less like suspicion than assessment. Mundungus Fletcher was conspicuously not present, which meant he was probably upstairs stealing something. Ron and Hermione were there too, sitting together at the far end of the table, and they both looked up when Harry came in with the particular expression of people who'd received his letter from yesterday and had been waiting for an explanation with varying degrees of patience. Hermione's patience was clearly at critical mass. Ron just looked excited, which was one of the things Harry appreciated most about him. You got my letter, Harry said, sitting down. I got your letter, Hermione said, and then I spent 6 hours in the Hogwarts library through Dumbledore's Flu connection, and then I got 3 more books from my parents' place, and I need you to explain everything starting from the beginning. She had a stack of notes in front of her. She'd already started. What's going on? Lupin asked. He was watching Harry with the quiet attention he always had, looking for the thing underneath the thing. Harry looked around the table. Lupin, Tonks, Moody, Ron, Hermione, Mrs. Weasley. Not the worst collection of people to start with. He put his right hand on the table. There was a moment of silence. Then Tonks let out a sound that was not quite a word. Moody's magical eye spun to focus on the rings and stayed there. Lupin went very still in the way of someone who has just been surprised by something significant and is managing his reaction carefully. Merlin's beard, Ron said, with feeling. That's approximately accurate, Harry agreed. What followed was an hour and a half that Harry thought of afterward as the first real conversation he'd had at Grimmauld Place, not a briefing, not a careful parceling out of information by people who'd decided what he needed to know, but an actual exchange. He talked. They listened. Hermione interrupted 14 times with questions that were exactly the right questions. Moody asked 3 questions that were all about security and threat assessment, which was useful. Lupin sat quietly until Harry got to the part about the suppressors, and then his face did something complicated and controlled that Harry chose not to press on, at least not yet. Who put them there? Lupin asked. His voice was even. Ragnok said multiple casters working together. Placed when I was 15 months old. Harry met his eyes. I don't know yet. I'm going to find out. The suppressors would have affected your connection to Voldemort, Hermione said, not looking up from her notes. She was writing very fast. The Slytherin suppressor, if it was dampening your Parseltongue and related abilities, it might have also been creating a bottleneck in the Horcrux connection. Which means without it, you might be able to close the connection deliberately, Harry finished. Yeah. I've been testing it this morning. I can feel where it is. I can push it closed like a door. He paused. I can also open it further than I could before. I haven't done that yet. I want to understand what that means before I try it. Hermione looked up. Her expression was the one she reserved for information that alarmed her and excited her in equal measure. Harry, if you can control the connection, then I potentially have access to whatever Voldemort knows. Yes. Harry had thought about this for most of last night's walk home. I'm not doing that unilaterally. We do it carefully, with preparation, with a way out if it goes wrong. Right, Lupin said. He seemed to have come to some internal resolution, because the complicated thing in his expression had settled into something cleaner, a careful, committed attention. What do you need from us? From you specifically, Remus? Knowledge of how the order works and where its gaps are. Harry hesitated for half a second and then said what he'd been thinking since he read the documents at Gringotts. The order is operating as a reactive force. Voldemort moves, we respond. That's not strategy, it's crisis management. I want to know if you agree. Lupin was quiet for a moment. Yes. I agree. Then we're going to change that. Mrs. Weasley, who had been getting progressively more agitated through this conversation, set down a fresh pot of tea with more force than necessary. Harry, you're 16, I'm the lord of 4 ancient houses with an Emery seat on the Wizengamot and a veto over all Wizengamot proceedings, Harry said, without heat. I understand that's strange and I'm not trying to be difficult about it. But I need everyone in this room to understand that I'm not asking permission for what I'm going to do. I'm telling you my plans because I trust you and because I want your help. The kitchen was quiet. Mrs. Weasley looked at him for a long moment, and he looked back steadily, and something shifted in her expression, not acceptance exactly, but recognition. The recognition of someone seeing a change that has already happened. All right, she said, quietly. Tell us the plans. Braxthorn came in through the kitchen door at 11:15 with her case and her bone and amber compass and a list of ward assessments that she laid on the table beside Harry's tea. Foundation wards are intact and active. The Slytherin-era subwards responded to your bloodline ring. I've documented 17 distinct protective enchantments that were dormant and are now active following your claim. She tapped the list, including one that I describe as a blanket scrying prevention field that now extends to approximately half-a-mile radius. Anyone attempting to magically surveil this location will get noise. She paused. There's also one I haven't seen before. Sub-foundation, very old, possibly original to the Black family's acquisition of the property. It reads as a truth compulsion ward. Anyone who enters this house with active intent to betray the inhabitants will experience significant magical discomfort, escalating rapidly to incapacitation. That's useful, Harry said. It's been dormant for about 40 years. Your claim activated it. Braxthorne snapped her case shut. I'd also recommend changing the Fidelius anchor. Currently it's keyed to the property itself with you as keeper. I can rekey it so that the secret is held in your blood claim rather than the property, which means it can't be broken by destroying the property, and it transfers with you rather than with the building if you need to relocate. Do that. And add a secondary layer that requires my rings to verify, in addition to the spoken secret. Braxthorne gave him the look of a specialist encountering a client who actually understands what they're asking for. That will take about an hour. I'll be here. Hermione waited until Braxthorne had gone back outside before leaning forward across her notes. Harry. The Emery's seat. The absolute veto over Wizengamot proceedings. Do you understand what that means in practice? Tell me what you found. The Wizengamot Charter of 1707, the one that established the ministry's authority and absorbed the previous Wizengamot structure, specifically preserved all pre-existing lordship rights, including the original Merlin protocols. Those protocols predate the ministry by about 700 years. She laid a piece of parchment on the table, dense with close writing in her precise hand. The Merlin protocols grant the Emery's seat holder the right to call emergency sessions with less than the usual notice period. They grant the right to introduce legislation that bypasses the normal committee review process. They grant the right to challenge any existing law using ancient precedent. She looked up. And they grant the right to formally censure any ministry official for abuse of power, which, in the original protocols, carries immediate suspension from office pending a full hearing. Harry looked at the parchment. Umbridge. And Fudge. And at least 8 Wizengamot members who voted to give Umbridge her educational decree powers. Hermione's voice was careful and precise, but there was something underneath it that wasn't calm at all, something that had been building since her own experience with Umbridge's quill last year. Harry, if you use the Merlin protocols correctly, you can do what no one has been able to do for the past 2 decades. Which is hold people actually accountable. She met his eyes. Not politics. Not positioning. Actual legal accountability using rules that predate every form of corruption the current system has built into itself. Harry was quiet for a moment. I need about a week, he said. Maybe 2. I need to understand the protocols completely before I walk into the Wizengamot with them. I need the right moment, public enough that it can't be buried, documented enough that it can't be denied. I can have a full analysis ready in 3 days. I know you can. He smiled at her briefly. I also need Neville. Ron looked up from where he'd been quietly reading the Wizengamot voting records with increasing visible horror. Why specifically Neville? Because Bellatrix Lestrange tortured his parents into insanity and then walked free for 2 years after Voldemort's return, while the people who had the power to put her back in Azkaban voted to pretend she hadn't returned. Harry's voice was level. Neville has standing. Legal standing, as the son of 2 torture victims of documented Death Eaters. If he wants to use it, that standing gives him the right to petition the Wizengamot for a formal reckoning. And I want him to know that option exists. Ron was quiet for a moment. Yeah, he said. He'd want to know. The afternoon settled into a productive rhythm that felt nothing like the usual grim old place atmosphere of barely managed crisis. Hermione worked through her notes at the kitchen table, occasionally asking Harry questions that were really just her thinking out loud in his direction. Ron made sandwiches with the efficient cheerfulness of someone who processes stress through feeding people. Lupin sat with Harry for an hour in the drawing room and talked, carefully and honestly, about the Order's actual capabilities and actual limitations. The conversation had the feeling of something that had been needed for a long time and was happening now only because Harry had created a space where it was possible. Moody left mid-afternoon and came back an hour later with a sealed envelope that he handed to Harry without explanation. Inside was a handwritten note in a sharp, angular hand that Harry didn't recognize. "I received your letter. I'll meet you where and when you choose. A. Bones." Harry looked at the note for a moment and then looked at Moody. "You vouched for me. Told her you had standing she wasn't aware of and that you weren't wasting her time." Moody's magical eye fixed on him steadily. "You're not going to waste her time, are you, Potter?" "No." "Then I vouched for you." He paused. "Amelia Bones is one of 3 people in that ministry who does her job without an angle. Don't make me regret the introduction." "I won't." He wrote back to Amelia Bones suggesting a meeting at Gringotts, neutral ground, warded, with Ragnok present as a legal witness, in 4 days. Then he spent the rest of the afternoon in the library, which had been at least partially de-doxied since his 5th year and contained, among the dubious Black family collection, several texts on preministry wizarding law that Hermione had already found and flagged with little colored strips of parchment. One of the flagged sections was titled On the Rights and Obligations of the Foundational Seats. Harry read it twice, slowly, making notes in the margin. The language was archaic but penetrable, and the content was, there was no other word for it, explosive. The 4 foundational seats didn't just carry voting rights and veto powers. They carried the ancient right of high summoning, the legal authority to compel the attendance of any witch or wizard in Britain at a Wizengamot session, regardless of their ministry status or personal preference. Dumbledore could compel attendance of witnesses. The minister could compel attendance through court order. But the high summoning was different. It was older and it was absolute, and a person summoned under high summoning who failed to appear was, under ancient law, in default of their magical obligations, which carried penalties that the ministry had never formally repealed because they'd never expected anyone with the right to invoke them to actually do so. Harry circled this section 3 times. He was still in the library at 8 in the evening when Neville Longbottom arrived through the flue. Harry had written to Neville asking him to come, but he hadn't explained much, just "there's something you need to hear and I'd rather say it in person." So Neville arrived in a cloud of green fire, looking mildly apprehensive in the way he'd mostly stopped looking since the Department of Mysteries, which had apparently burned something out of him, not the fear exactly, but the fear of the fear. He dusted himself off, looked around the library, looked at Harry, and looked at the rings. "Blimey," he said quietly. "Yeah." Harry gestured to the other chair. "Sit down. I want to tell you what I found yesterday." He told Neville everything. All of it, without softening or strategic omission. Neville listened with the concentrated quiet of someone who had learned to measure how much to react to things, but Harry watched his face and saw the moments where that discipline slipped, when Harry mentioned the Slytherin seat and the Wizengamot records, when Harry laid out what Hermione had found about the Merlin protocols. When Harry described the right to petition for a formal reckoning for documented victims of Death Eater torture, Neville went very still. "You're sure about the legal standing?" he said. His voice was careful in the way of someone stepping onto ice and testing each step. "Hermione's checked it 4 times. You're the surviving head of a household that's suffered direct, documented, intentional harm by individuals who are currently walking free. Under the ancient conventions that the Merlin protocols operate under, that gives you standing to petition the Wizengamot for a formal accountability hearing. Not a trial, they already had trials, however fraudulent. A formal reckoning. Which is different. How different? A trial determines guilt. A reckoning assigns consequence to parties that allowed or facilitated the harm, including the political bodies that enabled them to walk free." Harry paused. "In other words, we can go after the people who let Bellatrix out." Neville's jaw tightened. He looked at his hands for a moment. Then he looked at Harry, and his brown eyes were very clear and not remotely apprehensive. What do you need me to do? I need you to formally accept the invitation to appear as a petitioner at the Wizengamot session I'm going to call. I need your testimony documented by Gringotts as a legal record before the session. And I need you to stand in front of those people and say what happened to your parents and what the political consequences of their negligence have been. Harry met his eyes. But only if you want to. This is your choice, Neville. I'm not using you as a piece in something. Neville was quiet for a moment. My Gran thinks I should stay out of politics. Your Gran thinks a lot of things. She also thinks, Neville said slowly, that what happened to my parents is a wound that gets bigger every time someone looks away from it. He exhaled. I'll do it. Harry nodded. Okay. What about Dumbledore? Neville asked. Not with any particular edge, just the honest question. I'm going to tell him in person, Harry said. Tomorrow. Before I've done anything public. He paused, looking at the flagged pages spread across the library table. He deserves to hear it from me directly. Dumbledore arrived at Grimmauld Place the next morning at 10, presumably summoned by one of the Order members who'd been at yesterday's kitchen conversation. He walked into the drawing room where Harry was waiting, and his expression was the careful pleasant one he deployed when he already knew the shape of a conversation he needed to navigate. He stopped when he saw the rings. Not a dramatic stop, Dumbledore didn't do dramatic stops. More a slight pause, a slight recalibration in his blue eyes, a faint adjustment to the pleasant expression that brought it closer to something genuine. My dear boy, he said, and sat down in the chair across from Harry without being invited, which was fine, because Harry had put the chair there for him. I see Gringotts was somewhat more forthcoming than usual. They were extremely professional, Harry said. Would you like tea? Please. Harry poured. They sat across from each other in the slightly formal way of two people who care about each other and need to say difficult things. The morning light came through the curtains and lay across the floor in strips. You knew, Harry said. Not an accusation. A fact being placed on the table for examination. Dumbledore looked at his tea for a moment. I knew about the Peverell connection. I suspected the Gryffindor line, but I had no documented proof. He paused. I did not know about the Merlin inheritance. That was, genuinely unknown to me. The suppressors. A longer pause. Dumbledore's expression was, for once, not the comfortable controlled serenity he usually managed. He looked old, in this light. Not weak, the power in him was unchanged, that vast, steady competence that Harry had always been aware of. But tired. And something that might have been remorse. I was told, Dumbledore said carefully, by Lily and James, that they had authorized certain protective enchantments to be placed on you as an infant. To protect you from detection by Voldemort. The theory being that if your full magical signature was visible, he might find you more easily. He met Harry's eyes. I did not place those enchantments. I did not authorize them specifically. But I was told they existed and I allowed them to remain. Because managing my power level managed me, Harry said. Dumbledore was quiet. Not on purpose, Harry added, and meant it. I don't think you intended it that way. But I think you got used to it. Got used to the version of me that the suppressors created, the version that needed your guidance, your protection, your management. He paused. The version that was the right size for your plan. The silence was long and not comfortable. Outside, someone, probably Tonks, knocked something over in the hallway and swore quietly. I owe you an apology, Dumbledore said finally, and his voice was entirely unadorned, no warmth or wisdom wrapped around it. Just the words. I should have had your accounts properly reviewed years ago. I should have ensured you had your full inheritance and your full capabilities. I told myself I was protecting you, and I was, partly. But partly I was protecting the plan. He looked at his hands briefly. It was wrong. Harry looked at him for a long moment. I know you love me, he said. I know this has never been simple for you. I'm not ending our relationship over it. He paused. But I need you to understand that I'm not going to be managed anymore. Not by you, not by the ministry, not by anyone. What I'm doing now, I'm telling you as a courtesy, because you deserve to know, and because I respect you. But I'm not asking permission. Dumbledore studied him across the rim of his teacup. What are you going to do? Harry told him. Clearly and completely, the same way he'd told the kitchen, the same way he'd told Neville. He watched Dumbledore's expression move through several subtle gradations: surprise, calculation, concern, something that was unmistakably admiration, and finally a complicated settling that Harry interpreted as an old man deciding, possibly for the first time, to let something happen rather than shape it. The Emery seat, Dumbledore said when Harry finished. If you exercise the absolute veto, the Wizengamot becomes a body that can only act with my agreement on anything. Yes. Harry looked at him steadily. That's an enormous amount of power to concentrate in one person. It is. I know. I'm going to use it to dismantle the system that makes that kind of concentration possible, and then I'm going to build something that doesn't require it. He paused. That was always the intention. Dumbledore was quiet for a long moment. You'll need allies in the Wizengamot who understand what you're doing and why. I have some. I'm getting more. Amelia Bones. Among others. The Malfoy seat, Dumbledore said carefully. Harry had been waiting for that. Lucius is in Azkaban. The Malfoy seat is being held by proxy. Draco can claim it if he chooses, he's heir. If Draco makes the right choices in the coming months, having the Malfoy seat aligned with what I'm building is useful. He paused. If he doesn't, the Malfoy seat is politically isolated and irrelevant. You've thought about Draco. I've thought about everyone. Harry stood, because the conversation had reached its natural end and he wanted to end it while they were still in a good place. I'm calling the Wizengamot session in 11 days. I'd like you to be there. Dumbledore stood as well, and for a moment they were just two people standing in a drawing room with the morning light on the floor between them. Then Dumbledore reached out and placed his hand briefly on Harry's shoulder, not in the guiding, steering way he sometimes did. Just briefly, genuinely. I'll be there, he said. The next 8 days were the most productive of Harry's life. Hermione's analysis of the Merlin protocols arrived on day 2, 47 pages, cross-referenced, indexed, annotated, and color-coded in a system that Harry spent 20 minutes learning but then found genuinely efficient. He read it twice, made his own notes, and then met with Hermione for 3 hours to discuss the sections he wanted to deploy first and the order of operations that would make each one land properly. The meeting with Amelia Bones at Gringotts happened on day 3 and lasted 4 hours. Amelia Bones was not what Harry had expected. He'd built a vague image in his mind of someone formidable and formal, correct in the political way of people who've survived a long time in a corrupt system by being scrupulous. What she actually was turned out to be considerably more interesting, a solid, square-jawed woman in her 50s who wore the expression of someone who had been angry for a very long time and had learned to run on that anger efficiently. She had a monocle, which she used like a weapon. She asked questions the way Moody did, not sequentially but from unexpected angles, testing for the gaps in an argument, looking for the places where reasoning was soft. She spent the first hour making Harry prove he was serious. He spent it answering her questions directly and without hedging and watching her monocle assess him. At the start of the second hour, she said, "You're going to call an emergency session using the high summoning." "Yes." "Fudge will attempt to adjourn it immediately." "He can't. Not if I hold the Emery's seat and not if the high summoning has been formally invoked. The adjournment would require my agreement. He'll challenge the validity of your claims. Gringotts will provide certified documentation for all 4 lordships. The documentation is legally unimpeachable." Harry paused. He'll also try to cast doubt on my motives. He will. She looked at him steadily. What are your motives? I want a wizarding Britain where the people who tortured Frank and Alice Longbottom into insanity can't walk around going to Quidditch matches. I want a system where a man's innocence doesn't depend on having the right political connections. I want a ministry that is afraid of the people it governs, rather than a people who are afraid of the ministry. He paused. And I want Voldemort dead, which requires a functional wizarding society capable of actually opposing him rather than pretending he doesn't exist. Amelia Bones looked at him for a long moment, the monocle glinting in the Gringotts candlelight. All right, she said. Tell me what you need. On day 5, the first owl came from Draco Malfoy. It was brief, written in a cramped hand that suggested the writing had been started and stopped several times before this version. I know what you're planning. Half the Wizengamot knows. You should know that Umbridge has been to the manor twice in the past month and my mother thinks she's there to monitor rather than advise. If that's useful, fine. If not, ignore this. Harry read it twice and then wrote back, it's useful. Thank you. If you want to talk, the Floo address is the usual one. The wards will let you through. He wasn't sure Draco would come. He thought there was maybe a 30% chance. The things that made Draco Draco, the pride, the conditioning, the long investment in a particular idea of the world, would make stepping through that Floo very hard. But the intelligence Draco had just offered, unprompted, meant the number wasn't 0. And Harry had learned to work with non-zero numbers. On day 8, standing in the Slytherin ancestral property that was now legally his, a manor in the western Scottish Highlands that the goblins had opened for him, stone and cold air and rooms that smelled of 8 centuries of accumulated magic, Harry stood in the main hall and looked at the walls. Slytherin crests carved in stone, a serpent motif that ran through every architectural detail like a signature. The magic of the place was old and sophisticated and entirely comfortable with his presence, recognizing the blood claim with the same matter-of-fact immediacy as the rings. He stood in the hall and felt the various pieces of what he was building settle into their final positions, like a complicated mechanism clicking into alignment. Hermione had sent a note that morning, everything's ready. Legal framework is complete. Documentation is certified. Neville's testimony is documented. Amelia has confirmed 7 votes guaranteed on your side and 4 more likely. Whenever you want to call the session. Harry looked at the serpent carved above the main door, not a dark symbol, not in this context, not in this house. Just old magic, old power, old lineage. His. He took out a piece of parchment with the 4 house crests and the Emery seal, and wrote the formal high summoning notice for an emergency session of the Wizengamot. In 11 lines of archaic but perfectly formulated legal language, he called every member of the Wizengamot to appear at the Ministry's Wizengamot chamber in 3 days' time, under compulsion of their magical obligations, to receive formal notice of a challenge to their legislative authority. He signed it with all 4 lordship titles and the Emery seal. He sent it to Gringotts for certified dispatch. Then he stood in Slytherin's hall in the grey Scottish morning and let the cold air and the old stone hold him for a moment, and thought about all the people who told him he wasn't ready, wasn't old enough, wasn't the right kind of person for the thing that needed to be done. He thought about the Dursleys' small kitchen and the cupboard under the stairs and the letter that had come on his 11th birthday and every year since that had piled more weight on his shoulders without ever, not once, asking if he was all right under it. He thought about Sirius, who had deserved better than everything he got. Then he rolled his shoulders, walked to the Floo, and stepped into green fire. 3 days. Then the Wizengamot. Let them be ready. Chapter 3, the name on the walls. The Ministry of Magic on a normal Tuesday morning had the energy of a large machine running slightly too hot, functional, bureaucratic, and fundamentally indifferent to the individual humans moving through it. The atrium fountains had been replaced after the battle last year, the new one sleeker, more deliberately impressive, the gold of the statues brighter and more self-conscious than the old. The moving ceiling showed a clear blue sky that bore no relationship to the actual weather outside, which was overcast and threatening rain. Harry stepped out of the green fire at 8:45 in the morning wearing robes he'd had made 3 days ago, not flashy, not ceremonial in the way that screamed look at me, but well-made and deliberate, deep charcoal gray with subtle embroidery at the cuffs that incorporated all 4 house symbols in a pattern small enough to miss if you weren't looking and impossible to misread if you were. His right hand was visible. The rings caught the atrium's artificial light and held it. He'd arrived early on purpose. Hermione was already there, waiting near the security desk with Neville, both of them in formal robes. Hermione looked like someone who had prepared so thoroughly for something that the preparation itself had become a kind of armor, calm and absolutely ready, her notes in an organized folder that she held with the grip of someone who knew exactly what those notes contained and what they were worth. Neville looked like someone standing at the top of a cliff who has decided to jump and is at peace with that decision, not fearless exactly, but the fear had been processed and set aside and what remained was a clean, clear resolve that suited him. Luna Lovegood was there too, which Harry hadn't expected. She was standing slightly apart from Hermione and Neville, wearing robes of deep blue that made her look like a piece of winter sky, and she was watching the atrium fountains with the serene attention she gave most things. She turned when Harry approached and looked at him with those wide, pale eyes. "You look different," she said. "More like yourself. Is that a good thing?" "It's the best thing." She smiled, and it was the smile of someone who has known something for a long time and is pleased to see others catching up. "The Raxburts are completely gone, by the way. Whatever was fogging your thinking, it's cleared." She tilted her head. The rings helped. Harry decided to accept this. "What are you doing here?" "Supporting you. Also," she added, with perfect matter-of-factness, "I want to watch Fudge's face when he realizes he can't stop you. It'll be educational." Ron came through the floor 20 seconds behind Harry, straightening his robes and looking around the atrium with the expression of someone who is choosing to be calm and is mostly succeeding. Behind him, unexpectedly, came his father, Arthur Weasley, in ministry robes, who looked at Harry for a moment with an expression that was complicated and genuine and didn't try to hide either quality. "I've been in this ministry for 23 years, Arthur said, shaking Harry's hand in the way of someone saying something between the words. "I want to be in that chamber today." "I'm glad you're here," Harry said, and meant it completely. They went together through the atrium toward the lifts, and Harry noticed the shift as they moved, the way people's attention tracked them, the cluster of ministry workers near the fountain who stopped their conversation as Harry passed, the security wizard who looked at the rings on Harry's right hand and then looked again. The high summoning notices had been dispatched and received 3 days ago, certified by Gringotts. By now, every Wizengamot member in Britain knew what was coming. And because Wizengamot members talked to people, and people talked to other people, a significant fraction of the working ministry knew as well. 2 witches near the lift entrance whispered something to each other and then looked at Harry with an expression he'd seen before, the particular mixture of hope and apprehension of people who want something to change and aren't quite sure the change will be safe. He didn't stop to reassure them. There'd be time for that later. Right now, the task was the chamber. Amelia Bones was waiting at the entrance to the Wizengamot's level 10, accessed through a separate lift that required ministry authorization Harry now had through his Wizengamot seat credentials, which Ragnok had filed 2 days ago through proper channels with the irritated efficiency of a goblin who found the ministry's bureaucratic processes tedious but navigable. She was in her full Wizengamot robes, deep plum with silver, and she had the monocle in and the expression of someone who has been doing a job under difficult conditions for a long time and is cautiously allowing themselves to hope that the conditions are about to improve. "Good morning," she said. "It's been eventful downstairs." "How eventful?" "Fudge called an emergency ministry meeting at 7 this morning to discuss procedural irregularities in the notice you sent. His legal team has been arguing since 5 a.m. that the high summoning is not valid under current ministry law." She paused. "Their lead legal counsel abandoned the brief this morning at 6:30. "Why?" "Because I sent him the relevant sections of the Merlin protocols at midnight and he apparently spent the night reading them and concluded that arguing against them would be professional suicide." She said this with a crisp satisfaction. Fudge now has the ministry's junior legal team on it. The junior team is 23 years old and has been out of school for a year. How are they doing? They've been crying in the break room on and off since 8. She said this without particular cruelty, just the factual notation of people confronting the gap between what they expected law to be and what it actually was. Are you ready? Yes. She studied him for a moment with the monocle eye. Most people who've walked into that chamber for the first time are frightened. Even the ones who shouldn't be. I grew up in a cupboard under some stairs, Harry said. That chamber is larger and more comfortable and no one in it has ever locked me in. Amelia Bones looked at him for a moment. Then she turned and led him toward the chamber doors. The Wizengamot chamber was a court in the old sense, the sense that predated the distinction between judicial and legislative power, when both functions lived in the same body and both derived authority from the same source. The tiered seating rose steeply on 3 sides, carved stone and dark wood, capable of accommodating the full membership of the Wizengamot with the formal witnesses and observers in the gallery above. The chair at the center of the floor, the witness chair, was deliberately isolating, designed by people who understood that isolation was its own form of pressure. The chamber was already more than half full when Harry walked in, and the noise level dropped by several degrees the moment he appeared in the doorway. He walked to the floor without hurrying. He didn't look at the assembled members with any particular drama, just the natural attention of someone taking stock of a room. He located Dumbledore in the highest row, seated with an expression of alert, careful neutrality. He located Lucius Malfoy's empty seat. Lucius was in Azkaban, the seat held by a proxy, a thin elderly wizard who was already watching Harry with unconcealed anxiety. He located the 3 circled names from the Gringotts records, sitting together in the middle tier, and noted that all 3 of them looked like people who'd had a bad week and were expecting a worse morning. He found his seats. 4 of them, spaced according to the ancient charter, the Gryffindor seat in the upper tier on the right side, the Slytherin seat in the upper tier on the left, the Peverell seat in the center row, and the Emery seat. The Emery seat was different from the others. It was at the front of the chamber, floor level, facing the tiered seating rather than the witness chair. It was built from a stone that was slightly darker than the surrounding floor, inlaid with the Emery's crest, a dragon and a star, rendered in metal that caught the light like it was generating the light rather than reflecting it. It had been empty for so long that the chamber's regular cleaning spells had apparently treated it as a permanent fixture rather than functional furniture, and there was something slightly untouched about it. Harry sat in the Emery's seat. The chamber went completely silent. Not the working silence of a room settling before proceedings. The specific silence of something that has not happened for a very long time happening now. He felt the seat recognize him, not metaphorically, but in the literal, physical way of magic responding to its rightful owner. A warmth that moved from the stone through the back of the chair and into the air around him, and every candle in the chamber brightened by a third simultaneously. The Emery's crest on the stone floor glowed briefly, gold and white, and then settled. From the gallery above, someone audibly caught their breath. Cornelius Fudge made his entrance 30 seconds later, which Harry respected as tactical timing, entering after Harry reduced the impact of Harry's entrance and reasserted Fudge's authority as the presiding official. He came through the main doors with 3 ministry officials flanking him and the expression of someone who is frightened and has decided to wear anger over it like a coat. He was in full formal robes, the lime green of his bowler hat swapped for the deep burgundy of his official Wizengamot presidential robes, which he clearly hoped conveyed authority. He looked at Harry in the Emery seat. His jaw tightened visibly. This session, Fudge said, settling into the presidential chair on the elevated platform at the chamber's head, has been called under disputed circumstances. The ministry's legal office has raised significant questions about the validity, Minister. Harry's voice was conversational. Not loud, not aggressive. Just clear. The high summoning was invoked under the Merlin Protocols of 987 AD, which were formally preserved by the Wizengamot Charter of 1707, which your legal office would know if they'd read past the index. He paused 1 beat. The session is valid. Shall we proceed? Fudge's face went through several colors. The thin, anxious proxy in the Malfoy seat made a small sound. Several of the older Wizengamot members in the higher tiers were watching with the focused attention of people who have spent decades in rooms like this and know when something genuinely significant is happening. The chair recognizes, Fudge said, and the words came out with the forced control of someone keeping a lid on something, the claimant to certain lordship seats, who has invoked the right to address the Wizengamot on matters of formal challenge to legislative authority, Harry said. Using the legal mechanisms of the Merlin Protocols, sections 4 through 11, and the ancient right of reckoning as documented in the Hogwarts Charter of 990 AD. He reached into his robe and produced the folder Hermione had compiled. I have certified documentation from Gringotts confirming all 4 lordship claims and the Emery's seat inheritance. I'm happy to enter it into the record. He handed the folder to the chamber's clerk, a middle-aged witch with ink-stained fingers who took it with the professional composure of someone who had seen a great many things in this chamber and was choosing to process this as simply another document requiring filing. She opened it, glanced at the first page, and her composure flickered for half a second before reasserting itself. Entered into the record, she said. Fudge leaned forward. The ministry's position is that certain of these claims, Cornelius. Dumbledore's voice came from the upper tier, quiet and carrying in the way his voice always carried. The documentation is from Gringotts. Unless you intend to challenge the validity of a Gringotts certified inheritance record, which I believe would constitute a rather significant diplomatic incident with the Goblin Nation, I would suggest we accept the documentation and proceed. The silence that followed was the silence of a chess match where one side has just realized they've lost 2 pieces simultaneously. Fudge leaned back. His knuckles were white on the arms of his chair. Proceed, he said. Harry stood. The Emery's crest on the floor brightened slightly as he rose, as though the magic of the seat was attending to him, and he felt the shift in the chamber, the attention of 63 witches and wizards and the gallery full of observers, focused on him with a density that would have been overwhelming a week ago. He wasn't overwhelmed. He was, quite simply, ready. I want to start with something simple, he said. Not the legal mechanisms or the protocols or the historical precedents. Just a question. He let the question sit for a moment, and the chamber was very quiet. How many people in this room voted, in the summer of 1995, to grant Dolores Umbridge special educational decree authority at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry? Nobody answered. Nobody was expected to answer. It was the kind of question that answers itself by being asked in the right room. I know the number. It's 31. Harry looked slowly around the tiered seating. Of those 31 votes, 14 came from individuals who also voted, between 1981 and 1984, against investigating at least 6 documented Death Eater activity reports. He paused. Of those 14, 9 voted to release convicted Death Eaters from Azkaban following Voldemort's first defeat, on grounds of insufficient evidence, evidence that was, in several cases, documented in this chamber's own records. The anxiety in the room had a texture now, specific, personal, the anxiety of people being described rather than just addressed. I'm not here to relitigate those votes today, Harry said, and watched several people visibly relax, and then watched them tighten again when he continued, I'm here to establish the pattern. Because the Merlin Protocols, which I am formally invoking as of this session, give the Emery seat holder the right to challenge any existing law using ancient precedent, to censure any ministry official for abuse of power, and to compel the Wizengamot to undergo a formal audit of its legislative authority. He looked at Fudge directly. All of which I intend to exercise. In detail. In this chamber. Starting today. Fudge had gone the color of old paper. You are a child, I am Lord of the Houses of Gryffindor, Slytherin, Peverell, and Emerys, Harry said, without raising his voice, and I hold the senior seat in this chamber under protocols that predate the ministry itself. My age is not a legal consideration in this context. He paused. If you'd like to argue it, I'll cite the relevant sections, but I should warn you that Section 7 of the Merlin Protocol specifically addresses attempts to dismiss the Emery seat holder on grounds of personal characteristics rather than legal standing, and the penalty for such attempts is automatic censure. Someone in the upper tiers let out a short breath that was almost, but not quite, a laugh. The first matter, Harry said, turning back to the full chamber, is formal censure of Dolores Jane Umbridge, Senior Undersecretary to the Minister, for documented abuse of power during her tenure as High Inquisitor and Headmistress of Hogwarts. He reached into his folder and produced a second document. I have 37 signed testimonies from current and former Hogwarts students, 6 from Hogwarts staff, and a report from the school's own medical records documenting injuries consistent with the use of a blood quill as punishment, a device banned under the Educational Restrictions Act of 1921. He handed this to the clerk as well. I move to formally censure Undersecretary Umbridge under Section 9 of the Merlin Protocols, which carries immediate suspension from all ministry positions pending a full accountability hearing. The chamber erupted. Not violently, these were politicians, not brawlers, but the sound was significant, multiple people speaking at once, the scrape of chairs, Fudge's voice cutting through trying to call order, the gallery above buzzing with the particular frequency of people watching something they'll talk about for the rest of their lives. The 3 circled names from Harry's records were on their feet, objecting loudly, and somewhere in the middle of it all Amelia Bones's voice cut through with crisp precision, I second the motion. As head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, I have reviewed the evidence and find it sufficient to warrant formal proceedings. The noise hit another level and then Dumbledore spoke from the upper tier, not raising his voice, just using the particular quality of authority that meant everyone instinctively stopped talking to hear him. The motion is properly formed and has been seconded by the head of Magical Law Enforcement, Dumbledore said. Under the Merlin Protocols, which this chamber has formally acknowledged as valid through its acceptance of the documentation, the motion must be voted upon. I believe we should proceed. Fudge looked like a man who has just watched the floor give way under his feet and is still trying to process whether he's falling. He looked at Harry. He looked at Dumbledore. He looked at the documentation in the clerk's hands. Vote, he said, and the word came out thin and stripped of all its usual authority. The vote was not 31-0. It was not even close to the dramatic landslide Harry might have hoped for in a perfect version of events. But it was 41-22 in favor of the censure motion, and 41-22 was more than 2/3, which under the Merlin Protocols meant the motion carried with full force. The clerk read the result in a clear, steady voice that carried through the suddenly quiet chamber. Harry looked at his list and made a small note. He looked up and found Neville in the gallery, who gave him a nod, one sharp, deliberate movement, and Harry nodded back. The second matter, Harry said, concerns the formal petition of the House of Longbottom regarding accountability for documented harm to House Longbottom's senior members. He looked up at the gallery. Neville. Come down. Neville Longbottom descended from the gallery with the measured pace of someone who knows that how you walk into a room is a kind of statement. He was wearing House Longbottom formal robes that Harry suspected his grandmother had never expected him to wear in circumstances like this, deep brown and gold, the family crest visible, very much the correct dress for a house lord making a formal petition. Because that's what Neville was, Harry had pointed out to him 2 nights ago, he was the acting head of the House of Longbottom, and it was about time he acted like it. He stood on the chamber floor and looked at the assembled Wizengamot with the expression of someone who has been angry for so long that the anger has become structural, not hot, not unstable, just built into the load-bearing architecture of who he is. My name is Neville Frank Longbottom, he said. His voice was steady. My parents are Frank and Alice Longbottom, former Aurors, who were tortured into permanent psychological incapacity on the 31st of October, 1981, by Bellatrix Lestrange, Rodolphius Lestrange, Rabaston Lestrange, and Bartemius Crouch Jr., he paused. They are currently in the long-term ward of St. Mungo's Hospital, where they have been for 14 years. My mother cannot remember my name. My father has not spoken a coherent sentence since I was 2 years old. The chamber was absolutely still. Bellatrix Lestrange, Neville continued, is currently free. She escaped from Azkaban in January of this year and has not been recaptured. The Ministry's response to her escape was to deny that Lord Voldemort had returned and to take no meaningful action toward her recapture. He looked at Fudge directly. I am petitioning this body for a formal reckoning, not for Bellatrix Lestrange's recapture, which is an Auror matter, but for accountability regarding the political decisions that kept her imprisoned inadequately and the Ministry decisions that prioritized denial over action following her escape. One of the three circled names, a heavy-set wizard named Thickness, whom Harry had identified as the most politically connected of the three, stood up. The boy has no standing to petition, he has standing under the Longbottom House claim and under Section 6 of the Merlin Protocols, which I have already invoked, Harry said, without turning around. Please sit down, Mr. Thickness. You cannot simply. Harry turned and looked at him. It wasn't a threatening look. It wasn't anger, exactly. It was something quieter and considerably more unsettling, the look of someone who has already run every version of this conversation and knows exactly how each one ends, and has time. Thickness sat down. Harry wasn't sure Thickness knew why he'd done it, but he did it. Neville, Harry said. Continue. Neville continued. He spoke for 14 minutes, and the chamber listened in the particular quality of silence that a room achieves when it knows it is hearing something that will be recorded and remembered. He was not theatrical about it, he'd never been theatrical, it wasn't in his nature, but the lack of theater made it more affecting, not less. The simple structure of what had happened and what had been allowed to happen, set out in plain language by the son of the people it had happened to. When he finished, he looked at the assembled Wizengamot once more. I'm not asking for sympathy, he said. I'm asking for accountability. Those are different things. He walked back up to the gallery. Harry let the silence hold for 10 full seconds before speaking again, because Neville's words deserved the space. The formal petition of the House of Longbottom is entered into the record, he said. I move that the Wizengamot appoint an independent accountability commission, reporting not to the minister but to this chamber, to investigate all ministry decisions related to the handling of Death Eater activity between 1981 and present, with particular focus on the period following the documented return of Lord Voldemort. Amelia Bones, seconded. The vote this time was closer, 38 to 27, but it still carried. Fudge's face had moved through so many gradations of color and expression over the past 40 minutes that it had settled into something almost blank, the expression of a person who has stopped trying to manage events and is simply experiencing them. His hands were flat on his chair arms. He was looking at Harry with something that wasn't anger anymore, it was fear, the careful, calculating fear of a man who has just understood that the ground he built his career on has been removed from under him. Harry looked at his list. The third matter, he said, is a motion to establish the Foundational Review Commission, a standing body with authority under the Merlin Protocols to review all Wizengamot legislation passed in the last 20 years for compliance with pre-ministry wizarding law. He paused. This commission will have the power to recommend suspension of any legislation found to be in violation. The Emery's seat will hold oversight of the commission's proceedings. This one was fought harder. 3 of the more capable Wizengamot members, not the 3 circled names, who were by now operating in pure survival mode, but 2 older wizards and 1 sharp-faced witch who understood exactly what the review commission represented, raised substantive procedural objections that required Harry and Amelia Bones working in tandem to counter, methodically, with the relevant protocol sections. It took 20 minutes of genuine back and forth that at several points became genuinely heated, and at one point the sharp-faced witch, Griselda Marchbanks, whom Harry had noted as a complicated figure, corrupt in some respects but not stupid, made an argument about the scope of ancient law versus modern governance that was actually good enough that Harry had to take 30 seconds to formulate the correct response. He found it. He used it. Marchbanks acknowledged the counter with a slight nod that was, from her, probably the equivalent of a standing ovation. The commission passed, 35 to 30. The session had been running for 2.5 hours. Harry looked at his list. He had 2 more motions prepared, but he looked at the chamber, at the exhaustion and agitation in the upper tiers, at the gallery which was standing room only now, observers having packed in from the corridors outside, at Fudge who looked like a man at the end of a very long rope, and made a tactical decision. Not today. 2 more motions today would push too hard, create a backlash, give Fudge's people time to consolidate opposition. The Foundational Review Commission and the Umbridge Censure and the Longbottom Petition were enough for one session. Let the reality of those 3 things sink in. Let the people who voted for them understand what they just committed to. Let Fudge and his allies have 2 weeks of knowing what was coming without being able to stop it. I have no further motions for today, Harry said. The session can be adjourned. Fudge adjourned it with the speed of someone who has been waiting to leave a room for hours. The chamber became very loud very quickly, the way it does when people have been holding themselves in formal posture for a long time and are suddenly released from it. Harry stayed in the Emery's seat while people moved around him, and several of the Wizengamot members who'd voted with him made their way down to where he was, some with the careful interest of people exploring a new political alliance, some with something that looked closer to genuine relief. An elderly wizard with a Scottish accent pressed his hand briefly and said, "Long overdue," before moving on. The clerk caught his eye and gave him a look of professional admiration that was worth more, in its way, than most of the more explicit congratulations. Hermione materialized at his left shoulder from somewhere in the gallery. Umbridge suspension is effective immediately, she said, in a controlled undertone that was doing a poor job of hiding her satisfaction. The clerk filed the censure paperwork within 2 minutes of the vote. Good. Fudge's office has already issued a statement to the Prophet calling the proceedings irregular. The Prophet is going to bury it if they can. They won't be able to. Not with the gallery full. Harry looked up at the gallery where he could see at least 2 people who had the focused, assessing look of journalists. Is there a Prophet reporter up there? Rita Skeeter, Hermione said. Harry nearly smiled. Well. She's got something real to write about for once. Luna appeared on his right, serene as ever. Neville is all right, she said, answering the question Harry had been about to ask. He cried a little in the corridor. The good kind. Harry exhaled. Good. He was gathering his papers when he felt someone stop near him, not Hermione, not Luna, not any of the friendly faces from the vote. A deliberate stop, the stop of someone who has chosen their moment carefully. He looked up. Draco Malfoy stood at the edge of the chamber floor, still in his gallery observer position technically, but he'd come down the stairs and was standing on the boundary between the gallery's domain and the chamber's floor as though testing the weight of the step he was considering. He looked different from what Harry was used to. The Draco of school was all performance, the sneer, the angle of the chin, the studied contempt that Harry had spent 5 years reacting to instead of seeing through. This Draco was something underneath the performance, tired, wary, carrying something heavy, and clearly trying to calculate whether the thing he was considering was the most dangerous or the least dangerous option available to him. He looked at the rings on Harry's hand. Something moved in his grey eyes. My mother, he said, very quietly, is in that house with him. She doesn't want to be there. A pause. I don't know what that's worth to you. Harry looked at him steadily. It's worth something, he said, equally quiet. Everything you give me that's true is worth something. Draco looked at him for a long moment, the calculating assessment of someone who has grown up in a world where trust is a weapon and is trying to work out if this is an exception, and then he looked away. The Manor's East Wing, he said. There's a chamber he's using that no one from the Order knows about. The wards are dark, second-generation Slytherin variants. Your rings, he glanced at Harry's hand, your Slytherin ring would recognize them. Might be able to override them. Harry absorbed this carefully. Why are you telling me? Draco's jaw was tight. Because he killed my friend, he said, and the word friend came out with the specific pain of someone who hadn't let themselves use it in a long time. Theodore Nott. 3 weeks ago. Because his father failed at the Department of Mysteries and he wanted to make an example. He looked at the chamber floor. I'm not noble. I'm not reforming. I want him gone. And you seem to be the only person actually trying to accomplish that, instead of just talking about it. Harry was quiet for a moment. The offer to come through the floor still stands. I know. Draco straightened, and some of the performance came back, the careful reassembly of the shield he'd probably been building since he was old enough to understand what his family was, but it sat differently now, more like something he'd chosen to put on rather than something he'd been born into. I'll think about it. He walked back up the gallery stairs without looking back. Harry watched him go. Then he turned to find Hermione at his shoulder, having heard most of that. Her expression was the one she wore when she was recalibrating a long-held position, reluctant but honest. He's telling the truth, Harry said. Probably, she conceded. Doesn't mean it's not also useful to him. Both things can be true. She considered this. Yes. Both things can be true. Moody found them in the corridor outside the chamber, and he looked at Harry with his magical eye in a way that meant the Real I was looking somewhere else entirely. Fudge has called a press conference for 6 this evening, he said. Damage control. He's going to try to frame today as a procedural irregularity perpetrated by an underage. He's going to try to say I'm manipulated by Dumbledore, Harry said. Or by Voldemort. Or by both simultaneously, which will be an interesting argument. He paused. I want to give a statement to the Prophet before 6. Rita Skeeter, Hermione said again, in the tone she reserved for things she found personally objectionable but professionally inevitable. Rita Skeeter has been writing things about me since I was 14, Harry said. At least this time I can give her something true. He looked at Moody. Can you arrange it? Give me an hour. He gave Moody an hour and spent it in the ministry canteen with the rest of them, tea and slightly stale sandwiches and the particular exhausted, alive feeling of people who've just done something that mattered. Luna ate a sandwich with absolute contentment and said nothing for most of it, which was its own kind of comfort. Ron went over the vote count with Arthur, both of them identifying the swing voters who'd been uncertain and trying to map their political motivations. Neville sat quietly and drank his tea and looked like someone who has been carrying a weight for so long they've forgotten what it feels like to put it down, and is now relearning. How are you? Harry asked him. Neville was quiet for a moment. My Gran's going to see the account in the Prophet tomorrow morning and she's going to be furious, he said. And then she's going to be proud. He paused. She doesn't really know how to be proud of me yet. I think she's been waiting for a reason. Harry nodded. Now she has one. Hermione was already drafting Harry's statement on a piece of parchment, occasionally looking up to ask him to confirm a legal point. The statement was careful, not inflammatory, not triumphant in the way that invites counterattack, but completely unambiguous. It named what had happened in the chamber today. It named the motions, the votes, the outcomes. It named Umbridge suspension. It named the Longbottom petition and what it meant. It described the Foundational Review Commission in terms a general reader could understand. And at the end, in language Harry suggested and Hermione refined over 2 drafts, it said, this is not the end of what needs to happen in the Wizengamot. It is the beginning of a process. The wizarding world has laws that predate its current government and are considerably more comprehensive than that government has found convenient to remember. Those laws have not been repealed. They are active, valid, and now being invoked. Every member of this body should understand that the standard by which they will be assessed going forward is the standard of those laws, not the habits of the last 20 years. The Foundational Review Commission will meet for the first time in 14 days. The Emery's seat will exercise its oversight function at every subsequent Wizengamot session. This is not a power play. This is what accountability looks like. Everyone in that chamber today will have the opportunity to be part of building something worth building. The ones who prefer the old way will find it increasingly difficult to maintain. Rita Skeeter arrived at the canteen with a quick quotes quill already hovering and a gleam in her eye that Harry recognized as the look of a journalist who has seen a story large enough to make her career. Lord Potter, she said, sitting down with the bold efficiency of someone claiming territory. You've had quite a morning. Yes, Harry agreed, and handed her Hermione's statement. This is my official position. You're welcome to quote it directly. He paused. I'll answer 3 questions. Choose carefully. Her eyes moved over the parchment. The quick quotes quill trembled with suppressed eagerness. The Umbridge censure, she said. You have 37 testimonies. Will you release them publicly? The testimonies belong to the people who gave them. I'll ask each of them whether they want their account published. Anyone who does, I'll facilitate. He paused. I expect most of them will want to. She didn't write that down, she was processing. Fudge is going to say you're too young to understand the consequences of what you're doing. That's not a question. No. She looked at him. Are you? I understand the consequences, Harry said. I've been understanding consequences since I was 11. The difference is that now I also have the tools to act on that understanding. He paused. 3rd question. She was quiet for a moment, and in the quiet the quick quotes quill stopped hovering and settled onto the table, as though she was thinking for herself rather than performing. What do you actually want? She asked. Not the political answer. The real one. Harry thought about this for precisely 3 seconds. I want a world where the people in St. Mungo's long-term ward who are there because someone tortured them for sport are the thing the ministry talks about, instead of an embarrassing problem to manage. He met her eyes. I want it to be embarrassing to be Cornelius Fudge. I want the people who did nothing when they could have done something to have to sit in rooms and explain themselves. He paused. And I want Voldemort dead. Everything else is in service of that. Skeeter looked at him for a moment, and the gleam in her eye was different now, something less mercenary, something closer to the particular feeling of a person who got into a profession for the stories it might let you tell and has mostly been disappointed. That'll do, she said, picking up her quill. Harry drained the last of his tea. Outside the canteen windows, internal windows, showing the ministry's own corridors, he could see more people moving than usual, the building buzzing with the energy of a place where something significant has just happened and nobody is quite sure yet what it means. His right hand rested on the table, the 4 rings warm against his fingers. Today had been the first move. Not the final one, not by a long distance. There were 22 votes that had gone the wrong way in that chamber, and behind those 22 votes were 22 people who would now begin working against him with the motivated energy of people whose position is under genuine threat. Fudge would call his press conference and try to reframe the narrative. Umbridge would contest her censure through every available channel. The 3 circled names would meet tonight or tomorrow and begin strategizing. And somewhere beyond all of this, Voldemort was in the Malfoy Manor East Wing, in a chamber warded with second-generation Slytherin variants, and the war that all of this political scaffolding was being built to support was still out there, still coming. But the name was on the walls now. Every person who'd been in that gallery had seen the Embry's crest light up when Harry sat down. Every journalist in the room had seen the vote tallies. Every ministry worker in the atrium would hear about it by end of day, and every witch and wizard who read the Prophet tomorrow morning would hear about it in Skeeter's prose, which was vivid if nothing else. Harry Potter had walked into the Wizengamot and done something that hadn't been done in 800 years. The world knew. Let them decide what to do with that. Chapter 4, The Architecture of Ruin. The Prophet ran Skeeter's story on page 1. Not the front page that Fudge had presumably hoped for, the one where ministry affirmed stability or underage wizards' reckless power grab dominated the morning read. The front page that actually appeared was a full photograph of Harry in the Emery's seat at the moment the crest lit up, the 4 rings visible, the candles blazing in the background, and a headline in the largest type Harry had ever seen on a newspaper, the name on the walls, Lord Potter invokes ancient protocols, censures Umbridge, calls for reckoning. Skeeter had, apparently, decided that her career was better served by the truth than by Fudge's preferred narrative, which meant either that she'd found her principles or that she'd correctly calculated which way the wind was blowing. Harry suspected the latter but didn't care which. The article itself was 6 columns, jumped to pages 2 and 3, and was the most factually accurate thing he'd ever seen under Skeeter's byline. She'd quoted his statement directly. She'd described the vote tallies without editorializing. She'd described Neville's petition in language that was simple and devastating and didn't try to wring sentiment out of it, which made the sentiment land harder. The letters started arriving at Grimmauld Place at 7 in the morning, before Harry had finished his first cup of tea. By 9 o'clock, Hedwig had made 3 trips and the kitchen table was covered in correspondence. Most of it was supportive, some of it cautiously, carefully supportive in the way of people who wanted to be on record but didn't want to attract attention, some of it with the raw, barely contained relief of people who had been waiting for something like this to happen for years. Several letters were from parents of Hogwarts students who'd been subjected to Umbridge detentions. 2 were from former Aurors who'd served with Frank and Alice Longbottom and wanted it noted that they hadn't forgotten. 3 letters were threatening, which Harry gave to Moody, who read them with professional interest and filed them with the particular satisfaction of someone adding to a collection. 1 letter was from Augusta Longbottom. It was 3 sentences long. My grandson conducted himself with extraordinary dignity yesterday. I was not previously aware of the depth of his courage. I am grateful to you for giving him the occasion to show it. Harry read it twice and then put it face down on the table because it made his throat tight and he had too much to do to indulge that. Fudge's press conference had happened the previous evening as promised. Harry had read the transcript. The Prophet had run it on page 4, significantly less prominent than it would have been a day ago, and assessed it with Hermione late the previous night. Fudge had called the session procedurally questionable, described Harry as a young man of obvious talent who has been provided with misleading legal counsel, and suggested that the Merlin protocols required further expert review before their validity could be confirmed. He's stalling, Hermione said. She'd been saying this at intervals since 11 the previous night, each time with slightly increased certainty. He knows the protocols are valid, his own legal team confirmed it before they handed the brief off to the juniors. He's buying time to find a way around them. Is there a way around them? She looked at him over her parchment. Not a legitimate one. What about an illegitimate one? She was quiet for a moment. There's a clause in the 1831 Ministry Supplementary Powers Act that could theoretically be used to argue emergency suspension of ancient law in times of national crisis. It's never been successfully invoked, but it exists. Would it work? It would fail in any competent court. But it would take time to fail. 3 months, maybe 4, if they ran it through proper channels. She paused. Which is time Fudge desperately needs. He's not going to get it. Harry turned back to his own notes. Find me the counter. The counter took Hermione until 2 in the morning, at which point she came into the drawing room where Harry had been working through the Foundational Review Commission's initial scope with Lupin and Arthur Weasley, and dropped 4 pages of notes on the table with the satisfied precision of someone completing a particularly difficult puzzle. The 1831 Act contains an emergency suspension clause, yes, she said, but the Merlin Protocols specifically include a provision, Section 14, that exempts foundational law from any emergency suspension. It was written in, clearly and explicitly, because Merlin apparently anticipated that future governments would try exactly this. She paused. He was thorough. He had 800 years of foresight, Lupin said mildly. Which is exactly what I intend to argue, Hermione agreed. Harry had been running on 4 hours of sleep for 3 days and felt, paradoxically, more alert than he had in months. The magic was still settling. The absence of the suppressors created occasional flickers of adjustment, moments where his perception of the world shifted slightly as a new channel opened and calibrated. It wasn't uncomfortable. It felt the way he imagined learning to breathe properly felt, after years of doing it wrong. The Slytherin bloodline abilities were the most noticeable change. He'd always spoken Parseltongue, but now it was less a trick of biology and more a genuine second language. He could think in it, structure complex thoughts in it, and he'd caught himself dreaming in it twice. The Slytherin analytical capacity was harder to define but unmistakable, a particular quality of attention, a tendency to see systems rather than individual events, to map the underlying structure of any situation before responding to its surface. The Peverell abilities were stranger. The relationship with death magic that Ragnok had mentioned wasn't dramatic. He didn't see ghosts more clearly or feel death approaching, but there was a quality of awareness that hadn't been there before. Curses felt different. When he practiced in the drawing room the morning after Gringotts, the killing curse simulation that Moody had set up to train against felt not exactly avoidable, but readable, in the way that a physical blow from someone becomes readable when you've learned to watch the shoulder and the hips rather than the fist. He could see the shape of the magic behind it. The Merlin inheritance was the least classifiable. It wasn't more power in the simple sense, it wasn't like turning up a volume dial. It was more like gaining access to a different dimension of magic altogether, one that operated on principles that weren't quite the same as what he'd been taught. He was still learning its shape. He suspected that learning would take years. He was getting 3 weeks. He intended to make the most of them. The Foundational Review Commission's first preliminary meeting happened 5 days after the Wizengamot session, at Gringotts, in the same chamber where Harry had done his inheritance reading. 7 people around the black stone table, Harry, Hermione as his legal advisor, Amelia Bones, Lupin as Order representative, Arthur Weasley as the Ministry's internal honest broker, a goblin legal expert named Sharpclaw who represented Gringotts' institutional interests, and a very old witch named Elvira Rosier, no relation to the Death Eater Rosiers, she'd mentioned dryly upon introduction, who was apparently the foremost living expert on pre-ministry wizarding law and had been waiting for someone to actually use it for approximately 40 years. Rosier was the most interesting person in the room. She was about 110 years old, which in wizarding terms meant sharp and experienced rather than frail, and she looked at Harry when he arrived with the assessing eye of someone who had spent decades being overlooked because she worked in an arcane specialty that nobody thought they'd ever need. Merlin's Protocols, Section 4 through 11, invoked for the first time in 807 years, she said, by way of greeting. I've been writing about those sections since 1972. I've had 3 papers rejected by the Journal of Wizarding Law on the grounds that the material was, and I quote, academically interesting but practically irrelevant. She sat down with the energy of someone who has been waiting a long time to be relevant. What do you need? Everything, Harry said. Starting with which pieces of current Wizengamot legislation are most vulnerable to a challenge under ancient precedent. Her eyes lit up. Sit down. This will take a while. It took 4 hours. What emerged from those 4 hours was a map, not a geographical map but a legislative one, a charting of which laws and which powers currently held by the Ministry and the Wizengamot were genuinely valid under ancient precedent and which were, as Rosier put it with devastating precision, built on sand that was itself built on sand. The most significant findings were 3. First, the Ministry's authority to define and restrict the use of magic, the entire architecture of what was permitted and what was banned, derived from a series of acts passed between 1709 and 1823. Those acts claimed authority under the Wizengamot Charter of 1707. The Charter of 1707 was valid. But several of the acts had overreached the Charter's granted powers by defining restrictions that the Charter had explicitly left to the foundational seat holders. In other words, laws about the use of unforgivables, about the registration of certain classes of magic, about the definition of dark magic, all of these technically required the endorsement of the foundational seats to have legal force. None of them had that endorsement, because the foundational seats had been empty when they were passed. Which means, Hermione said slowly, staring at Rosier's documentation, that technically, a significant portion of current dark arts law has a validity gap. Correct, Rosier said. I'm not suggesting those laws are wrong in substance. The ban on unforgivables is morally and practically correct. But the mechanism by which they're enforced is legally questionable, which means any conviction under those laws could theoretically be challenged. She paused. Which is exactly the kind of complexity that bad actors exploit. Bartemius Crouch Jr., Harry said quietly. His trial was conducted under legally questionable procedures, yes. Amelia's voice was tight. As were several others. "We're not reopening those trials," Harry said. "Not through that mechanism. What we're doing is using the validity gap to force the Wizengamot to pass properly endorsed versions of the same laws, which closes the gap and strengthens the legal foundation rather than tearing it down." He looked at Rosier. "Can we do that?" "With the Emery's seat, absolutely. The foundational endorsement process requires a formal motion, a certification by all relevant seat holders." She glanced at Harry's right hand, which in your case is all of them simultaneously, and a recorded vote. "It would legitimize every major piece of dark arts legislation in one session. And in return for legitimizing it, I get the right to set conditions on the endorsement." Rosier looked at him with something that was very close to delight. "Correct." The second finding was more immediately explosive. The Ministry's authority over Hogwarts, the power to appoint officials, to enforce educational decrees, to intervene in school governance, derived from a clause in the 1692 International Statute of Wizarding Secrecy Implementation Act, which had been appended to the Hogwarts Charter. But the Hogwarts Charter itself was one of the foundational documents that had established the original Gryffindor and Slytherin seats. The Ministry's educational authority clause had been added without the knowledge or consent of anyone holding those seats, because those seats had been empty, and was therefore, in Rosier's precise legal language, a unilateral amendment to a foundational document, which is explicitly prohibited under the terms of that document. "The Ministry," Harry said, very carefully, "has no legal authority over Hogwarts." "Correct. Which means every educational decree ever issued is invalid." "Legally speaking, yes." "Which means Umbridge's appointment as High Inquisitor was invalid from the beginning." "Legally speaking, absolutely yes." The third finding was the biggest. The Wizengamot's power to declare war, to authorize the use of extreme force, to sanction ministry operations involving the detention and prosecution of magical citizens, all of this derived from a powers framework established in 1850. That framework had been based on a legal opinion that the foundational seat powers were permanently dormant and therefore their oversight function had effectively transferred to the Wizengamot as a whole. But the 1850 legal opinion had been written by a ministry solicitor who had, as Sharpclaw noted with goblin precision, also been receiving financial consideration from three of the Wizengamot families who benefited most from the power transfer. "Conflict of interest invalidates the opinion," Sharpclaw said. "And without the opinion, the 1850 framework has no legal foundation. Which means the Wizengamot's current powers are operating under a framework that doesn't exist," Harry finished. "Doesn't have valid legal standing," Sharpclaw corrected, with the precision of a goblin who has a professional relationship with the difference between those two phrases. "The Wizengamot can still function. Its historical actions aren't necessarily void. But its claim to sovereign authority over the full range of matters it currently governs requires, under the original charter structure, the ongoing endorsement of the foundational seats. Which it has never had," Harry said. "Because those seats were empty." "Until now," Amelia said quietly. The table was silent for a moment. "So," Harry said, "in practical terms, the Wizengamot has been governing by a framework that was built on a fraudulent legal opinion, which means its authority in its current form requires my endorsement to be fully valid. And as a condition of that endorsement, I can require structural changes." "Yes," Rosier said. "I can require that certain powers be removed from the Wizengamot and established as independent functions." "Yes. I can require that the appointment process for the minister and the senior ministry officials be reformed." "Yes. I can require term limits, conflict of interest provisions, mandatory transparency measures, yes, yes, and yes." Rosier was practically vibrating with professional satisfaction. "You can require any structural change that falls within the scope of governance reform. The foundational seat holder's endorsement is not a rubber stamp, it is a constitutional agreement. You can negotiate its terms." Harry sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. He'd known this was possible, in the abstract, when Hermione's initial analysis had started suggesting the scale of what the protocols covered. But sitting here, in Ragnok's chamber, with the documentation laid out across the black stone table and 7 people who understood exactly what it meant, the concrete reality of it was significant. Not dizzying, he'd moved past the stage of being dizzied by this, but significant in the particular way of things that are real and large and require very careful handling. Timeline, he said. If I present the endorsement framework to the Wizengamot at the next session, 14 days from now, how long would full implementation take? Rosier calculated. The endorsement itself is a single-session vote. Implementation of the structural reforms would be staggered. Some things can happen immediately, others require transition periods. She paused. Realistically, the core framework is in place within 60 days. Full implementation within a year. Fudge will fight it. Yes. Can he stop it? Not legally. He can obstruct, delay, contest in every peripheral court available to him. She met Harry's eyes. But the Merlin protocols are specifically designed to be obstruction resistant. Merlin, as I said, was thorough. Harry nodded. Then we draft the endorsement framework. I want it ready in 10 days, which gives us 4 days of review before the session. He looked around the table. What I'm going to present is not a power grab. I want to be very clear about that, in every document we produce and every conversation we have about this. What I'm presenting is a legitimization. The Wizengamot gets the foundational endorsement it should have had all along, and in return it agrees to operate according to the standards that endorsement requires. He paused. The people in that chamber who've been doing their jobs honestly have nothing to fear from this. The ones who haven't, they should. Amelia was making notes. Sharpclaw was already working on the legal framework document. Rosier looked like someone who had finally, after 40 years, been given the canvas she'd been waiting for. The 10 days before the second session were the most intense of Harry's life, and his life had contained a basilisk and a dragon tournament and a graveyard resurrection, so that was a meaningful comparison. The work was constant. Hermione drafted. Rosier reviewed. Harry revised. Amelia provided political intelligence from inside the ministry. Sharpclaw produced legal certifications. Arthur mapped the likely votes and identified the key swing members who would determine whether the endorsement framework passed. Lupin coordinated with order members who had political connections Harry didn't, ensuring that the people whose support would matter most understood what they were being asked to support before they walked into the chamber. Draco came through the flow on day 4. He arrived at 11 at night, which Harry thought was probably intentional, late enough that he could claim to himself that he'd just been passing, that it wasn't premeditated. He came through in his school robes, which meant he'd come from somewhere he was supposed to be and deviated. He stood in the drawing room of Grimmauld Place looking at the wards. He could feel them, Harry knew, because the truth compulsion ward was active and anyone with reasonable magical sensitivity would register it, and then looked at Harry. "Your wards are Slytherin era," he said. "Yes. I can feel the truth compulsion." He said it flatly, like a fact being noted rather than a complaint. "You weren't exaggerating about the security." "I don't exaggerate about security." Harry gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit down." Draco sat. He looked around the room with the assessing attention of someone reading an environment, and Harry let him take his time. The drawing room was different from how it had been in 5th year. The worst of the Black family's more objectionable decorations had been removed or covered, the furniture rearranged to make the room feel less like a monument to pureblood ideology and more like a place where people actually lived and worked. Papers on the table, 2 empty tea mugs, a book of pre-ministry law with markers at a dozen pages. "You're actually going to do it," Draco said. "Yes. Tear apart the Wizengamot's authority and rebuild it. Restructure it. There's a difference." Draco was quiet for a moment. "My father's in Azkaban." "I know. If you restructure the Wizengamot's authority, the cases reviewed under the new accountability standards," he stopped. "Your father's case will be reviewed," Harry said, "under whatever standards of evidence and procedure the reformed system establishes. I can't promise you the outcome. He paused. What I can promise is that the review will be honest. Which is more than he got the first time, and more than most of the people around him will get. Draco's jaw was tight. He's not a good person. I know that too. But he's my father. It came out with the particular rawness of someone stating a fact they'd spent a long time fighting and have finally stopped fighting. And my mother is in that house with a Dark Lord and she is terrified every single day and there's nothing I can do about it from the outside. Harry leaned forward slightly. Tell me everything you know about Voldemort's current base of operations, his inner circle's movements, and what he's planning. Not because I'm going to use it recklessly, because I need to understand the threat clearly before I can address it, and I need information from inside that I don't have. Draco looked at him for a long moment. The truth compulsion ward hummed in the background, steady and old. If I do this and he finds out, he won't find out from this house. You can't guarantee. I can, Harry said. The wards here are keyed to my bloodline. The Slytherin-era subwards include an active scrying prevention field that extends half a mile. He cannot see into this house, he cannot hear into this house, and if he tries, the attempt will register on my wards and I'll know. He paused. You're safer here than anywhere he could monitor. Draco breathed in and out once. Then he started talking. He talked for 2 hours. Harry listened without interrupting except to ask clarifying questions, keeping the questions precise and purposeful so that Draco knew his information was being taken seriously rather than extracted and filed. What emerged was detailed and alarming in ways that changed Harry's understanding of the current situation considerably. Voldemort was not, as the Ministry preferred to believe, rebuilding slowly and carefully. He was moving fast, using the Ministry's denial as cover for a series of recruitment and consolidation operations that had been running for months. 3 major pureblood families had been brought into the inner circle through a combination of genuine belief and threats they couldn't counter. Several Ministry officials below the Wizengamot level, mid-tier bureaucrats, filing clerks, an employee in the Department of Mysteries, were either compromised or under imperious. The East Wing chamber Draco had mentioned was being used for something specific, though Draco didn't know exactly what, only that it involved artifacts that Voldemort had been collecting through his Death Eaters over the past year. Artifacts, Harry said. What kind? Draco's expression shifted slightly. Old ones. Ones with strong magical residue. He kept sending people out to collect them, specific ones, not random. He had a list. He paused. One of them, the one he seemed most interested in getting back, was described as something of yours. Something connected to your family. Harry went very still. The Hallows. Draco frowned. He kept saying something about mastery. About proving mastery. He looked at Harry's hands. The Peverell ring. He wants the Hallows, Harry said. Thinking fast, restructuring what he knew. The Elder Wand, Dumbledore had it, or had had it, there was a chain of ownership that got complicated. The cloak was Harry's, had been since first year. The Resurrection Stone was gone, destroyed, he'd thought, or at least rendered inaccessible in the Forbidden Forest. He thinks whoever controls all 3 has power over death. Does he? Harry thought about what Ragnok had said about the Peverell inheritance. The relationship with death magic. The immunity to certain classes of curse. Not in the way he means, he said. But he doesn't know that yet. Draco left at 1 in the morning, through the flu, without committing to anything in explicit terms. But before he stepped into the green fire he turned and said, with the deliberate self-consciousness of someone making themselves say something they've decided to say, Pansy Parkinson's father is on the Wizengamot. He's been reliable for Fudge but he's scared. He voted against the Longbottom petition because he was told to, not because he wanted to. He paused. He might be persuadable. Thank you, Harry said. Draco stepped into the flue. Harry stood in the drawing room for a moment in the quiet aftermath and let what had just happened settle. Then he wrote a note to Amelia Bones about Parkinson Sr., went to bed, and was asleep within 4 minutes. Umbridge made her move on day 7. Harry had expected something. The censure suspension was effective immediately, but Umbridge was not the kind of person who accepted effective immediately as a real limitation. She contested the censure through 3 separate legal channels simultaneously, had a solicitor arguing for emergency reinstatement in front of a ministry judicial panel, and published a statement in the Prophet calling Harry a dangerously misguided young man whose reckless wielding of ancient legal tools threatens the stability of wizarding society. What Harry hadn't expected was the direct escalation. He was walking through Diagon Alley on day 7 with Ron and Luna. He'd made a point of being visible, of moving normally through public spaces, because visible normalcy was its own kind of message, when 6 wizards in ministry robes appeared at the end of the alley. Not Aurors. Ministry officials, the kind that came from Fudge's office rather than the law enforcement departments. They were wearing the expression of people who had been told to deliver a message and were hoping the message would be received without incident. The lead wizard, tall, 50s, the particular bearing of someone who has spent a career adjacent to authority and absorbed its mannerisms without the substance, held up a folded document. Mr. Potter. You are requested to accompany us to the ministry for a formal assessment of your lordship claims under ministry. No, Harry said. The wizard blinked. I beg my lordship claims are certified by Gringotts and entered into the Wizengamot's official record, Harry said pleasantly. The ministry does not have authority to conduct a separate assessment of Gringotts certified inheritance records. The relevant legal principle is the Gringotts Independence Act of 1865, which establishes goblin inheritance law as sovereign within its domain. He paused. Additionally, any attempt to detain me without a formal or a warrant issued by the head of magical law enforcement would constitute illegal detention of a Wizengamot seat holder, which carries significant legal penalties under the Merlin protocols. He looked at the lead wizard steadily. I'd also note that Amelia Bones is the head of magical law enforcement and she has my flu address, which she has used several times this week. If she had issued a warrant, she would have used it herself. The lead wizard looked at his document. Then at Harry. Then at the document again. Ron, beside Harry, made a sound that he converted very quickly into a cough. I suggest, Harry said, that you go back to whoever sent you and explain that the legal approach requires revision. He paused. Have a good afternoon. He walked around them and continued down the alley. Luna fell into step beside him with perfect serenity, as though nothing of particular note had occurred. Ron waited until they'd turned a corner. Blimey, Ron said. That's going to be in the Prophet tomorrow, Harry said. Is that bad? No. It's good. Every failed attempt to stop what we're doing is public evidence that we can't be stopped through normal channels. He paused. It also tells me Umbridge is more rattled than I expected. That move was improvised, not planned. How can you tell? Because it was stupid, Harry said simply. She's smart enough to know it was stupid. She did it anyway, which means she's operating from panic rather than strategy. Luna bought ice cream from Fortescue's new replacement establishment, a nephew of Florian's who'd opened under a different name, and handed Harry a cone with the matter-of-factness of someone performing a necessary service. Panic makes people dangerous, she said conversationally, licking the edge of her cone. But it also makes them make the big mistake. She'll make the big mistake soon. I know, Harry said. I'm going to be ready for it when she does. The second Prophet story about the alley incident ran on page 1 the next morning alongside a follow-up on the Wizengamot session. Fudge's approval ratings, according to an attached survey, had dropped 14 points in a week. The survey sample was small and the methodology was questionable, but 14 points was 14 points. Parkinson Sr. came through an intermediary on day 9. He wanted a private conversation. Harry agreed, held the meeting at Gringotts with Amelia present, and spent 40 minutes listening to a frightened man try to calculate whether the political reality had shifted far enough to make honesty less dangerous than the alternative. The conversation ended with Parkinson committing to abstain on the endorsement framework vote rather than opposing it, which was not a guarantee but was movement, and movement was what the margin required. On day 10, the endorsement framework document was complete. Harry read it in full one final time, sitting in the library at Grimmauld Place in the early morning with the house quiet around him. It was 42 pages, which felt long but was, as Rosier had pointed out, actually quite concise for a constitutional framework. It covered the legitimization of dark arts legislation with conditions. It covered the removal of ministry authority over Hogwarts governance. It covered the reform of the Wizengamot's powers framework, stripping the body of its claimed sovereign authority in areas where the foundational seats had never endorsed it and replacing that authority with a properly structured system of checks. It covered mandatory conflict of interest declarations, term limits for ministry appointees, an independent judicial function separate from the legislative one. And it covered, in the final section, the one Harry had drafted himself rather than leaving to Hermione or Rosier, the establishment of a formal war powers protocol. A specific, limited set of emergency powers that the ministry could invoke during active magical conflict, with defined time limits, defined scope, and defined oversight by the foundational seats and an independent review panel. No more of Fudge's endless, convenient denial. No more of the previous war's summary imprisonments. If Britain was going to fight a war, it was going to do it under rules that couldn't be used to justify whatever the government found convenient. Harry set the document down and sat quietly for a moment. He thought about what he was doing, really thought about it, not the strategic version but the honest one. He was 16 years old. He had enormous power, newly claimed, still partly unfamiliar. He was using it to restructure the political architecture of a society he'd been part of for only 5 years. He was doing it fast, because fast was the only speed that worked against people with the motivation and the resources to stop him if he gave them time. Was he certain he was right? Not about everything. The details were Rosier's and Hermione's expertise and he trusted them but he knew his own limits. The pace was aggressive and aggressive pace created its own risks. Was he certain the system needed to change? He thought about the Longbottoms. He thought about Sirius, 12 years in Azkaban for a crime someone else committed. He thought about Cedric Diggory, whose death had been followed by the ministry's best efforts to pretend it hadn't happened. He thought about the suppressors on his magic at 15 months old. Yes. He was certain the system needed to change. Everything else was execution, and execution was something he'd been doing under pressure for 5 years. He picked the document back up, tucked it into its folder, and went to make tea. Voldemort's response to the Wizengamot session came on day 11, and it was characteristically direct. 2 Death Eater attacks in a single day, one on a Muggle family in Yorkshire, one on the home of a Wizengamot member who'd voted for the Longbottom petition. The Wizengamot member survived. 2 members of the Muggle family didn't. Harry heard about both by 10 in the morning through order channels, and he sat with the information and felt the weight of it, the real weight, the human weight, not the strategic weight, and then he put the strategic weight back on top because that was what the moment required. Voldemort was sending a message: the political process doesn't matter, the power I hold is the only power that counts, those who align with you are targets. Harry had anticipated this. Not the specific attacks, but the shape of the response, because Voldemort was also operating from a kind of panic, the panic of someone who has built his entire understanding of power around the idea that political authority is fragile and magical dominance is permanent. The Wizengamot session had challenged that understanding in a concrete way. He wrote 3 things. A statement for the Prophet, expressing his condolences to the victims' families and his unambiguous intention to continue what he'd started. A letter to Amelia Bones requesting that the attacks be formally recorded as Voldemort-directed terrorism for the purposes of the War Powers Protocol he intended to introduce at the next session. And a letter to Dumbledore, asking a direct question: the Elder Wand. Where is it and who controls the chain of ownership now? Dumbledore's response arrived within an hour, by personal fleur rather than owl, which meant the question had landed with force. Come to Hogwarts this evening. There are things I should have told you much sooner. Harry went. He sat in the office with the sleeping portraits and the strange instruments and the particular quality of Dumbledore's presence, vast and careful and, tonight, carrying more visible weight than usual, and listened to the full history of the Elder Wand. The chain of ownership. The defeat of Grindelwald. The vulnerability it created. What Voldemort was presumably planning. "He wants to win the Elder Wand from you," Harry said. "I believe so." "He'll come for you." "Yes." Dumbledore said this with the tranquility of someone who has made a particular peace with a particular fact. "I suspect that is rather inevitable." "It's not," Harry said. Dumbledore looked at him. "He thinks the wand's allegiance transfers through defeat or death," Harry said. "But the Peverell bloodline doesn't just create a relationship with death magic in the abstract, it creates a specific connection to the Hallows. All three of them. I can feel the cloak even when I'm not touching it. I've been able to since the rings." He paused. "I think the wand's allegiance can be established through bloodline claim rather than combat, if the bloodline is the original one." He paused again. "I think that's why Voldemort wants me dead before I figure that out." The office was very quiet. "Have you tested this?" Dumbledore asked. "Not yet." Harry looked at the shelf where the instruments turned and clicked. "I wanted to understand the theory first. The practice is the next 14 days. He left Hogwarts at 11 at night and walked back through the grounds under his cloak, feeling it differently now, the magic of it familiar and warm and his in the deep structural way the rings were his, and thought about the next session. 14 days had become 13. 13 days to finalize the endorsement framework, secure the votes, prepare the presentation, and understand enough about the Elder Wand's mechanics to make the argument that he intended to make. 13 days was enough. It had to be. Back at Grimmauld Place, Hermione was still awake, reading through the final endorsement framework document with a highlighter she'd conjured from a biro. She looked up when Harry came in. "Rosier found 2 more sections we can use," she said. Sections 18 and 19 of the protocols cover the Emery seat holder's right to establish an independent judiciary, completely separate from the Wizengamot. No political appointments, no ministry oversight. Add it to the framework. Harry. She lowered the document. "This is the most significant constitutional restructuring in Wizarding Britain since 1707. I know. Fudge is going to fight it with everything he has. I know that too." Harry sat down across from her. "Is the framework legally sound?" "Yes." "Then let him fight it." He looked at the document in her hands. "Let them all fight it. It doesn't matter how hard they push back against something that's legally correct and properly documented and publicly supported." He paused. "That's the whole point, Hermione. We built it so the pushback doesn't work." She looked at him for a moment, really looked at him, the assessing attention of someone who has known a person for years and is taking stock of who they've become. "You're ready for the next session," she said. It wasn't a question. "I've been ready since Gringotts," Harry said. "Everything since then has been building the architecture." She smiled, brief, genuine, slightly terrifying in the way her smiles sometimes were when they were expressions of genuine confidence rather than social performance. "Then let's finish it." They worked until 3 in the morning, and the framework that emerged was, in Rosier's phrase from the following day when she reviewed the final version, the most legally comprehensive instrument of governance reform produced in 8 centuries. Harry thought about Merlin, who had apparently thought of everything, who had built protocols specifically designed to still work after 800 years because he'd understood that the corruption they were designed to address was not a temporary problem but a permanent human tendency. He thought, "I know how you felt." Then he went to bed, set his alarm for 6, and slept without dreaming at all. Chapter 5, Fire and Foundation. The morning of the second session, it rained. Not the polite English drizzle that apologizes for itself, the real kind, horizontal and determined, rattling the windows of Grimmauld Place like something trying to get in. Harry was up at 5:30, standing at the kitchen window with his second cup of tea, watching the rain come down the street in sheets and thinking about nothing in particular, which was its own kind of preparation. Ron came down at 6 and made toast without speaking, which was one of the things Harry valued most about him. Ron understood that silence before something significant wasn't emptiness, it was concentration, and breaking it with conversation was a form of carelessness. He put a plate of toast in front of Harry and sat down across from him and ate his own breakfast while the rain hammered the windows and the house creaked around them with the particular articulation of very old buildings in bad weather. Hermione came down at 6:30 with the endorsement framework document under one arm and the expression of someone who has been awake since 5 reviewing her preparation and has concluded that the preparation is complete, which for Hermione was the closest thing to peace she experienced before high-stakes events. She sat down, accepted Ron's toast without looking at it, and read through the document one more time. At 7, Luna appeared through the flue in her deep blue robes carrying a small bag and looking like someone who has arrived at a party slightly early because they wanted to choose the best seat. "The rain is a good sign," she said, settling into a chair with her bag on her lap. "Old magic responds well to rain. It's cleaning energy." "Is that from the Quibbler?" Ron asked. "It's from my grandmother," Luna said serenely. She was almost never wrong about weather. Neville came through the flue at 7:15, carrying himself with the quiet solidity Harry had noticed in him since the first session. He'd been different since he'd stood on that chamber floor, not louder or more dramatic, but more occupying of his own space, as though something had been settled internally that had been unsettled for a long time. He sat down next to Harry and looked at him. "You've got the votes?" he asked. "Amelia has the votes," Harry said. 38 confirmed, 4 likely. We need 35 for the endorsement framework to carry. And Fudge's side? 20 confirmed against, 7 uncertain. Harry finished his tea. The 7 uncertain are the people who've been watching which way this goes. Today they're going to decide. How do you get uncertain people to decide in your favor? Harry thought about it. You give them a version of events where supporting you is easier and safer than opposing you. Not by threatening them, by making the landscape so clear that their own self-interest does the work. He paused. Some of them are genuinely uncertain because they genuinely don't know what the right thing is. Those ones just need to see it clearly. The ones who know and are pretending to be uncertain, they need to see that the pretending has become more costly than the choosing. Neville considered this. You sound like a Slytherin. I have a Slytherin lordship. I'm allowed. They arrived at the ministry at 8:30, an hour before the session was scheduled. The atrium was different from the first session, the energy had a different quality, denser and more charged, like a room before a storm rather than after one. Word had gotten out, which Harry had expected and counted on. The gallery would be full. Several international observers had requested attendance. Harry had seen the paperwork. There were representatives from the French Ministry, the German Wizarding Council, and 3 individual observers from the American Magical Congress, all of whom had apparently been following the Prophet's coverage with intense professional interest. What he hadn't fully anticipated was the people in the atrium. Ordinary witches and wizards, crowded 3 deep against the fountain area, far more than normal ministry foot traffic would explain. People who had come specifically because they'd heard what was happening and wanted to be here for it. He saw faces he recognized, parents of Hogwarts students, people from Hogsmeade, a woman who ran the apothecary in Diagon Alley who'd once told Harry she remembered when you couldn't walk down that alley without looking over your shoulder. They watched him cross the atrium with an attention that wasn't the usual celebrity recognition, it was different in kind, the attention of people who have a stake in something and are watching the person carrying it. He walked through them without performing anything. Just walked, because the directness was its own statement. A small girl, 7 or 8, pulled free of her mother's hand and held out a folded piece of parchment. Harry stopped. Took it. Unfolded it. It was a drawing, crayon and something that sparkled, probably spellotape, of a person in front of a large building, with 4 small rings on their hand rendered in 4 careful colors. The word thank you was written across the top in large, slightly uneven letters. He looked at the girl, who looked back at him with the frank, fearless attention of small children who haven't yet learned to be afraid of the people they admire. "Thank you," he said. She went back to her mother. Harry folded the drawing carefully and put it in his inner pocket, directly over his heart, and continued walking. Amelia was waiting at the Wizengamot level with 3 confirmed swing voters who had apparently arrived early for a reason. She gave Harry a look that communicated several pieces of information simultaneously. The votes were looking better than predicted. Fudge had arrived already and was apparently in a state, and the international observer's presence had changed the political calculus in ways that favored Harry's position. "The French observer introduced himself to 7 of our confirmed votes this morning," she said quietly, walking beside him toward the chamber. "The French ministry has been watching the protocol situation with interest. The fact that they sent someone speaks to the legitimacy of what you're doing, and several of our people noticed that." "Good," Harry said. Fudge noticed too. "He's attempting to characterize the international presence as foreign interference in British wizarding governance." "That's going to be a difficult argument given that I'm invoking British wizarding law," Harry said. "Ancient British wizarding law, specifically." "I know. I told him that." She paused. "He swore at me." Cornelius Fudge swore at the head of magical law enforcement. "Quite impressively, actually. I didn't know he had that range." She said this with the dry composure of someone adding a data point to an existing file on a subject. The chamber was already nearly full when they arrived. Harry walked to the Emery's seat, and again, the moment he sat, the crest lit and the candles brightened, and the chamber registered the moment with that particular quality of attention. Except that this time, several of the members who had voted against him at the first session were watching it happen with expressions that had moved from opposition toward calculation. The calculation of people who had spent a week in a world where the political geography had visibly shifted and were assessing where they stood on the new map. Dumbledore was in the upper tier again, in a different seat from the first session, one of the older seats, Harry noticed, a carved wooden chair that probably predated the current chamber fittings by 3 centuries. He caught Harry's eye and gave a brief, precise nod. Fudge arrived last. He came in with 5 ministry officials and a solicitor Harry didn't recognize, someone new, older and sharper looking than the junior team from the first session, meaning Fudge had found more competent legal representation. He settled into the presidential chair with the careful composure of someone who has decided that composure is the only remaining tool and is deploying it with everything he has. He looked, Harry thought, like a man who had spent a week being afraid and had come out the other side into something harder. Not resigned, Fudge was not the kind of person who resigned themselves to anything, but resolved. He'd made some kind of decision. Harry filed that and paid attention. "This session of the Wizengamot is called to order," Fudge said, and his voice was steady and controlled and entirely unlike last session. "Before the Lord of the Emery's seat presents the proposed endorsement framework, the Minister's office has prepared a formal response to the protocols invoked at the previous session." He looked at Harry directly. "I will be speaking to that response personally." Harry inclined his head. "The chair can speak." Fudge stood. He had notes, which he glanced at once and then seemed to decide not to use, setting them aside with the deliberate movement of someone choosing to speak from conviction rather than preparation. "I want to address this chamber," he said, "as its president for the past 7 years. I have led this body through the aftermath of the First War, through the rebuilding of our society, through the challenges of the past 2 years." He paused. "I have made decisions that, in retrospect, I would make differently. I have been." Another pause, more significant, inadequate to certain requirements of my position. The chamber was extremely quiet. Harry watched him carefully. "However," Fudge said, and here was the resolution Harry had identified, the thing he'd decided, the mechanism being used to compel this body's restructuring is not reform. It is the replacement of one concentrated authority with another. The Lord of the Emery's seat is proposing that the most significant governance changes in 3 centuries require his personal endorsement. That this endorsement is a permanent structural feature of the new system. He looked at Harry. "I want to ask," and I want this chamber to consider seriously, what happens when the lord of the Emery's seat dies? What happens when the seat is held by someone less principled? What happens when the endorsement requirement, which exists to constrain us, becomes the instrument by which a future lord constrains us in ways that are not beneficial? It was a good argument. Harry had been waiting for it because it was the best argument available to Fudge, the one with genuine substance, and it deserved a real response, not a dismissal. The minister raises a legitimate structural concern, Harry said. Let me address it. He stood. The endorsement framework I'm presenting today does not create a permanent endorsement requirement. It creates a transitional endorsement function, time-limited to a period of 7 years, during which the foundational seats hold oversight. At the end of 7 years, the reformed structures either stand on their own merits under the new legal foundation, or they are reviewed again. He looked at the chamber steadily. After the transition period, the endorsement function dissolves. The Emery seat becomes what it has always been, a senior seat with a veto on foundational matters, not a governor of ordinary proceedings. He paused. The framework includes explicit provisions addressing exactly the concern the minister raises. It's in section 16. He looked at Fudge. The minister should read section 16. Fudge looked at his solicitor. The solicitor made a brief gesture. Fudge looked back at Harry. I've read section 16, Fudge said. And here something shifted slightly in his expression, a concession so small it was barely visible, but Harry saw it. I would still argue that 7 years of foundational oversight is the minimum required to ensure the reforms bed in properly, Amelia said from her seat. Given that the current framework has been corrupted over a period of approximately 70 years, 7 years of oversight seems conservative. Several members of the upper tier murmured. Not in Fudge's favor. Fudge sat down. He wasn't finished, Harry could see that, but he'd made his best argument and it had been answered, and continuing to argue the same point would look like obstruction rather than principle. He was a politician, and politicians recognize the moment when the room has moved. The endorsement framework is formally presented, Harry said. Before we vote, I want to walk through the major provisions, because I want every member of this chamber to understand exactly what they're voting for. Not a summary, the actual substance. He talked for 40 minutes. Not to the documentation, from it, the way Dumbledore lectured, in the way that felt like reasoning together rather than being read to. He went through each major section, explained what it changed and why, answered questions from the floor as they came. Several of the questions were sharp, Griselda Marchbanks again, who seemed to have concluded that if she couldn't stop the reform she was going to shape it, and asked 3 questions that resulted in 2 clarifying amendments being added on the spot, both of which improved the document. He welcomed the amendments openly, because they were correct improvements and because welcoming them demonstrated something important about the kind of system he was trying to build. The swing voters watched this. The calculation in their expressions shifted. One of them, a witch in the middle tier named Longoria, who had been genuinely uncertain rather than strategically uncertain, Harry had concluded, because her voting record showed evidence of actual principles that were in tension with each other rather than simple self-interest, raised her hand during the question period. The independent judiciary provision, she said. How are judges appointed? Merit-based selection by a panel that includes 3 members appointed by the foundational seats, 3 by the reformed Wizengamot, and 3 by a new body of independent magical practitioners, healers, educators, Gringotts representatives. No single body holds majority appointment power. Longoria was quiet for a moment. That's better than the current system. Most things would be, Harry said, and a ripple of something moved through the chamber that was the closest thing to genuine laughter the Wizengamot had probably managed in years. Fudge's solicitor made 2 procedural objections during the presentation. Harry answered both, quickly and correctly, citing the relevant protocol sections. The solicitor was better than the junior team but was working against a legal framework he hadn't had adequate time to study, and both objections collapsed under the relevant provisions. After the second one collapsed, the solicitor made a small note on his parchment, underlined something, and did not raise a third objection. Harry respected that. The man was doing his job honestly and had recognized when the job was done. When Harry finished, he looked around the chamber. Any further questions before the vote? Nobody spoke. Then I'll move the endorsement framework to a vote, Harry said. The vote was 44-18. Not 38. Not the careful margins Amelia had projected. 44, meaning that 6 of the projected opposition had either abstained or switched, and all 4 of the likely votes had confirmed. The chamber registered the result with another of those significant silences, and then broke into the particular noise of a room where something permanent has just happened and everyone present knows it. Harry sat in the Emery's seat and breathed out slowly. 44-18. The endorsement framework was passed and entered into the record. The Wizengamot had formally accepted the limitations on its authority. The independent judiciary was established in principle. The ministry's Hogwarts authority was revoked. The War Powers Protocol was enacted. The corrupt architecture of 70 years had not been demolished. Demolition was fast and dramatic and left rubble. What had happened instead was something more surgical, the load-bearing walls identified, the ones that were actually holding the structure up preserved and strengthened, the ones that were holding nothing but their own position stripped back and replaced with something that actually functioned. It would still take months of implementation. Years to fully bed in. There would be legal challenges and obstruction and the grinding work of making institutions actually change rather than just formally agreeing to change. He knew all of that. But the framework was law now. Properly formed, correctly endorsed, entered into the record. He stood. He moved to collect his papers. Dolores Umbridge walked into the chamber. She came through the side entrance, the one used by ministry officials rather than Wizengamot members, wearing her full High Inquisitor robes, the ministry emblem, the pink of her cardigan underneath like a weapon of self-presentation, and she walked to the center of the chamber floor with the particular quality of movement that Harry had learned in 5th year meant she was doing something she'd calculated precisely and was very satisfied with. The chamber went very still. Under Emergency Ministry Powers Protocol 9b, she said, her voice the sweet, terrible thing it always was, every word wrapped in sugar that you could taste the poison through if you knew what to listen for. The Minister for Magic has authorized my appointment as acting senior overseer of Wizengamot proceedings, effective immediately. This authorization supersedes the censure issued under the so-called Merlin Protocols, which the Minister's office formally contests as procedurally invalid. She placed a ministry order on the clerk's desk with the precise motion of someone who has spent a very long time learning exactly how much weight a piece of paper can carry. The clerk looked at it. Then at Harry. Then at Umbridge. Harry looked at the ministry order. He recognized the mechanism, Emergency Protocol 9b, the one Hermione had identified as the theoretical workaround, the one that claimed the power to suspend ancient law in times of national crisis. The one that the Merlin Protocol specifically exempted foundational law from. He looked at Umbridge. She looked back at him with her wide, pale eyes, and the smile was the smile of someone who has been waiting for this particular moment and has been waiting patiently. Dolores, Harry said. His voice was very calm and very clear. Sit down. Her smile didn't waver. I don't believe you have the authority to. Section 9 of the Merlin Protocols, Harry said, which is the section under which you were censured, specifically states that a censured ministry official who attempts to resume their official function before a full accountability hearing is in violation of a foundational legal order. The penalty for that violation, he paused, is immediate and permanent removal from all ministry positions. Emergency Protocol 9b supersedes. Section 14 of the Merlin Protocols exempts all foundational law from emergency suspension. Section 14 was written specifically to prevent exactly this. I cited it in front of this chamber 11 days ago. He tilted his head. Did you actually read the protocols? Something moved in her expression, the first crack in the composure. The emergency protocol is valid, she said. I have ministry counsel who confirms. You have ministry counsel who gave you an opinion that contradicts established foundational law, Harry said. That opinion is not binding on this chamber. It is not binding on the Merlin protocols. And it is not binding on me. He looked at her steadily. Here is what is happening right now. You walked into this chamber in violation of your censure suspension. That violation, under the protocols I have formally invoked, triggers your permanent removal from ministry service. I am formally documenting that violation as of this moment. He looked at the clerk. Please note for the record that former Undersecretary Umbridge entered this chamber at, he checked the chamber clock, 10:47, in violation of her active censure suspension under Section 9 of the Merlin Protocols. The clerk, to her absolute credit, picked up her quill and noted it. Umbridge's composure cracked fully. The sweetness dropped away, and what was underneath it was not what Harry had expected. He'd expected rage, the particular hot fury of someone who's been thwarted. Instead it was something colder and more interesting. Genuine belief. She actually believed that she was right. That the order she represented was correct and necessary, and that people like Harry Potter were the disorder she was appointed to contain. You are a child, she said, and her voice was entirely different now, stripped of the performance, direct and hard. A child playing at power with ancient tools you don't understand, and when the consequences of this come, and they will come, it will not be the ministry that suffers them. I'm aware of the consequences, Harry said. I've been aware of consequences since I was 11 years old, and your ministry helped make sure I understood them clearly. He held her gaze. You should leave this chamber now. Voluntarily, while you still have that choice. A pause. Security will be here in approximately 30 seconds. She looked at him. He looked at her. The chamber was absolutely silent around them. The security wizards arrived at 35 seconds. Umbridge left. She didn't run, she walked, with her chin at the precise angle of someone refusing to acknowledge defeat while executing it. At the door she turned once, and her look was a specific kind of promise, the kind that doesn't need words. Harry let it land and didn't flinch. The chamber exhaled. Fudge sat in his presidential chair looking at the space where Umbridge had been with the expression of a man watching a fire he'd lit burning in a direction he hadn't planned for. He looked old in this light, in a way he hadn't looked before. Not powerful old the way Dumbledore was, but old in the way of someone whose moment has passed and has just understood that it has passed. He stood. This session is adjourned, he said. And then, with what Harry suspected was the last genuine dignity the man possessed, he walked out of the chamber without looking back. Harry gathered his papers and thought, that's not the end of Fudge. He's going to fight this through every institutional channel available. But it's the end of this version of him, the Fudge who could use the ministry as a personal tool to manage reality into a shape he preferred. That version was finished. He was halfway to the exit when the chamber's enchanted ceiling, which displayed the sky above the ministry, usually a careful ministry-approved version of whatever weather was occurring, went black. Not dark. Black. The specific, total black of magic actively replacing light with its absence. Then the temperature dropped 15 degrees in 4 seconds. Then the far wall of the chamber shattered inward. They came through the broken wall, 8 of them, in masks and robes, moving with the purposeful coordination of people who had rehearsed this. Not random Death Eaters. The inner circle, or close enough to it that the distinction barely mattered. Harry recognized the movements even before the faces became relevant, the particular cruelty of Bellatrix Lestrange in the way she moved, the calculated aggression of Antonin Dolohov, the brute force of Thorfinn Rowell. And behind them, walking through the broken wall with the unhurried certainty of someone who has arranged things precisely to his preference, Voldemort. The chamber erupted. Wizengamot members scrambling for the exits, spells flying, the particular chaos of people trained for bureaucratic functions suddenly confronting combat. Amelia Bones had her wand out immediately. Harry had always known she'd be fast, and a shield charm went up across the main exit in the same second, giving people a path out. Moody was there, somehow, materializing from the gallery with both eyes in full combat mode. 3 Aurors who'd been positioned in the gallery came over the railing simultaneously. Harry was already in motion. He moved forward, toward the Death Eaters, not away from them, and felt the magic respond to the movement the way it responded to his intent now, without the old gap between thought and execution. The Peverell curse reading ability was active at full intensity. He could see the spells being cast as shapes before they landed, the magic telegraphing its own trajectory. He deflected 2 killing curses with shields that he'd never been able to produce that fast before and ended the deflection moving rather than stationary, which was the difference between someone fighting defensively and someone fighting to win. Bellatrix came for him specifically, which he'd expected. She was terrifyingly fast. He'd known that from the Department of Mysteries. She moved through combat the way people moved through rooms they'd grown up in, instinctive and certain. She threw 3 curses in 2 seconds and each one was intended to incapacitate rather than kill because she wanted this to last, wanted to enjoy it, and the wanting was its own kind of vulnerability. He let the 3rd curse come closer than was comfortable and then sidestepped and sent a binding hex that caught her wand arm at the elbow. She converted the momentum of the binding into a roll that broke it, good, genuinely impressive reflexes, and came up already casting again. "Oh, you're different," she said, and her voice was the bright, horrible joy of someone encountering something that genuinely interests them. "What did they do to you, little boy? You're all lit up." "I claimed my inheritance," Harry said. "How's Azkaban?" She screamed and came at him with something that wasn't quite a spell. It was raw force, dark magic and fury condensed into a bolt of pure destructive intent, and it was the kind of thing that worked on people because most people's instinct was to shield against it, and shields against raw force just absorbed the force and still left you thrown across the room. Harry didn't shield. He stepped into it and met it with the Merlin inheritance, not a technique, not a learned response, something older and more fundamental, the way deep water meets a stone thrown into it, absorbing and redirecting. The bolt dissipated around him like smoke. Bellatrix stumbled. Genuine stumble, confusion, magical dissonance, the shock of someone who has thrown their best at something and watched it fail to register. Harry hit her with a stunning hex so strong she went through the air backward and hit the far wall and did not get up. He turned. Voldemort was standing in the center of the chamber, and the Death Eaters around him had been dealt with. Moody had taken 3, Amelia and the Aurors had managed 2 more, and the chamber was mostly cleared. Dumbledore had descended from the upper tier and was positioned to Harry's left, not in front of him, the specific positioning of someone who has consciously chosen not to stand between 2 other people for the first time in a long time. Voldemort looked at Harry, and his red eyes moved to the rings, and something passed across his face that was not quite surprise and not quite fear but was in the same neighborhood as both. "Harry Potter," he said. The voice was the same, cold and multi-layered and carrying that quality of absolute certainty that Harry had spent years learning was not the same thing as being right. "You've been busy." "I have," Harry agreed. "You made a mistake coming here." "Did I?" "Not a question." The head tilted, the eyes moving across Harry's hand, reading the rings with an intelligence that was, infuriatingly, genuine. "The Peverell line. The Slytherin line. My mother's family, of all things." A sound that was almost amusement. "And Merlin. And Merlin. You think that changes what happens between us?" "Yes," Harry said simply. Voldemort raised his wand. Harry felt it before the motion was complete, the specific signature of the killing curse beginning to form, the magic drawing in and concentrating with the cold finality that he'd felt at the periphery of his awareness since the graveyard. Except that now, with the Peverell inheritance active and the Merlin power running through him like a river at full current, the curse didn't feel like finality. It felt like something he could read. Something he could answer. He didn't raise his wand. He held Voldemort's gaze and felt the hallows, all 3 of them, the cloak on his back, the sense of the stone somewhere in the castle grounds, and the Elder Wand, which was currently Dumbledore's but whose allegiance was something more complicated and older than ownership, something that the Peverell bloodline understood in a way that transcended possession. The killing curse came. Harry met it with something he didn't have a name for. It wasn't a spell, it wasn't a shield, it was the Peverell relationship with death turned outward, a recognition of the curse's fundamental nature as a forced ending and a refusal of that forcing not through power but through the authority of someone who understood what death was and had the right to say not here, not now, not like this. The killing curse stopped. Not reflected. Not shielded. Stopped. In the air between them, it hung for a half-second as a visible thing, green light organized into destructive intent, and then dissipated like mist in the morning. The chamber was absolutely silent. Voldemort's face changed. Harry had never seen Voldemort's face actually change. It was always controlled, always deliberate, always performing certainty. What it did now was something genuinely involuntary. Not fear exactly. Something adjacent to it, the specific reaction of someone encountering a force they had categorized as impossible and cannot immediately recategorize. That's not possible, Voldemort said. His voice was even, but the evenness cost him something now. The Peverell bloodline doesn't fear death, Harry said. Your killing curse is built entirely on death as an absolute. Against a true Peverell heir, it has nothing to anchor to. He paused. You've been reading the Hallows wrong, Tom. The mastery of death isn't about conquering it. It's about understanding it clearly enough to not be controlled by it. He looked at him steadily. You've never understood it clearly. That's your whole problem. Voldemort's red eyes narrowed. You think one-party trick, I think you came here to make a statement, Harry said. And you've made one. You attacked the Wizengamot during an active session. That's an act of war against the wizarding government of Britain, and it's documented. Every person in this chamber witnessed it. The international observers witnessed it. He paused. You haven't frightened anyone. You've given us the War Powers Protocol activation that we needed. Something moved behind Voldemort's eyes. The recalculation of someone who is very intelligent and has just understood that he's been several moves behind. I came to demonstrate, Voldemort said, that your political games are irrelevant against real power. And I've demonstrated, Harry said, that real power isn't what you think it is. He kept his voice level and honest and entirely unafraid, because he wasn't afraid, he was angry, and the anger was the clean kind, the kind that doesn't burn out of control but runs steady and purposeful and long. You killed Theodore not because his father failed you. You attack Muggle families because they're defenseless. You're not powerful, Tom. You're spiteful. There's a difference, and every person in this room can see it. Voldemort looked at him for a long, cold moment. Then he looked at Dumbledore, who had not moved or spoken, standing to Harry's left like a very large, very still piece of weather. You've let him do this, Voldemort said, to Dumbledore. Something in his voice was almost curious. Your weapon. Your sacrifice. You've let him claim the power you kept from him. Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. Then, he was never mine to let. Voldemort's eyes came back to Harry. There was a new quality to the attention, not respect, not retreat, but something being filed and assessed and incorporated into a strategy Harry couldn't yet see. Voldemort was always thinking. Even here, even now, even in the moment of being stopped. The Hallows, Voldemort said quietly. Just to Harry, not to the room. You know what you need to know about the wand. More than you do, Harry said. Another long silence. The chamber around them was still and cold. Voldemort turned and walked back through the broken wall with the Death Eaters who were still standing. He didn't run. He walked, the same unhurried certainty as his entrance. At the breach in the wall, he paused without turning. We're not finished, he said. I know, Harry said. I'll be ready. He was gone. The chamber was very quiet. Then Moody's voice cut through from the far end, secure the building. Standard protocols. Practical and immediate, the right voice for the moment. Harry breathed out slowly. His right hand was warm, all four rings warm simultaneously, resonating in the particular way they did when the magic had been used at full intensity. He felt the aftermath settling through him, not exhaustion exactly, but the distinctive weight of having extended fully in every direction at once. Amelia appeared at his shoulder, slightly singed on one side, her monocle cracked but still in. "You stopped the killing curse," she said. "Yes." "With what?" "Peverell bloodline ability," Harry said. "It's complicated to explain. I'll want the full explanation later." She looked at the broken wall. "The War Powers Protocol is activated." "The moment the breach happened, yes. His attack on an active Wizengamot session is exactly the trigger condition in Section 8. Harry paused. "We can now mobilize formally. Full aura authorization. Cross-ministry cooperation. Legal framework for the response operations we've been planning. And Fudge?" Harry looked across the chamber at the presidential chair, which was empty. Fudge had left before Voldemort arrived. He thought about the man, frightened and inadequate and not without some genuine qualities that had been completely overwhelmed by his worst ones, and felt something that was not quite compassion but was in its territory. "Fudge resigned while we were fighting," came a voice from across the chamber. It was Percy Weasley, of all people, standing near the main door in ministry robes with a piece of parchment in his hand and an expression on his face that mixed professional shock with something much older and more personal. He looked at Harry. "He sent a formal letter of resignation to the clerk before the breach. It's been filed." Harry stared at him. Percy stared back. "He was always going to resign before he was removed," Percy said, and his voice had the quality of someone who has been thinking about something for a long time and has reached a conclusion they don't entirely know what to do with. "He wasn't brave enough for anything else." "Percy," Harry said carefully, "what are you doing here?" Percy looked at the resigned document in his hands, then at Harry, then at the broken wall, then back at Harry. Something was happening in his face, the careful, constructed professionalism cracking along the lines of something genuine underneath. "I've been here for the last 3 weeks," he said. "Working. Watching." He paused. "I owe my father an apology." "Yes," Harry said, simply. "Tell him when you see him." Percy nodded, very stiffly, and then managed something that was both deeply uncomfortable and entirely real. "What you're doing," he said. "What you've done. I wanted to say. It's right. It's the correct thing." He said correct the way he always said it, with the particular Percy inflection that turned it from a simple adjective into a comprehensive endorsement, and it was, in its way, the most Percy thing Harry had ever heard him say. "Carry on." He walked away with the document and the stiffness, and Harry watched him go and felt something in his chest that was complicated and warm. Neville was there, helping a shaken Wizengamot member find their dropped wand with his usual careful thoroughness. Luna was in the gallery still, unruffled, watching the aftermath with her wide eyes and a small notebook she'd apparently been writing in. Ron was in the doorway. He'd been in the gallery, not the chamber, and hadn't been able to enter during the combat, and his expression was the specific one he wore when he'd had to watch something happen without being able to affect it, which was harder for Ron than fighting. Harry walked to him. "Fine," he said, answering the question. "I know," Ron said. "I could tell." He paused. "You stopped a killing curse." "Yeah. With no wand movement. It's a bloodline thing. I'll explain it properly later." Ron looked at him for a long moment. "Okay," he said, and the okay carried about 11 different things inside it, the layered language of people who have been friends since they were 11 and have learned that the words often matter less than the fact of saying them. Hermione appeared from the side corridor, slightly out of breath, having evidently been waiting out the combat in the correct strategic location, which was not the chamber, and her expression was the most unguarded he'd seen from her all week, the relief that she'd been keeping under very strict professional control landing on her face in one go. "He came for you," she said. "He came to make a point. He made the wrong one." Harry looked back at the chamber, at the broken wall and the scattered furniture and the evidence of a fight that had been brief but entirely real. The international observers were still in the gallery, he noticed, with the focused attention of people who have just witnessed something significant and are carefully documenting it. We have the War Powers Protocol activation. We have Fudge's resignation. We have 44 confirmed votes on the endorsement framework. He paused. Today was a good day. Your definition of a good day needs reviewing, Hermione said. Probably. He didn't disagree. He walked back to the Emery's seat and picked up his papers, which had scattered slightly in the chaos, and reorganized them with the careful attention of someone managing the symbolic alongside the practical, because how you leave a room matters as much as how you enter it. The Emery's crest in the floor was still warm. He could feel it through his boots. Outside the chamber, the ministry was going to be in emergency mode for hours: the resignation, the attack, the formal war powers activation, the 1,000 administrative consequences of everything that had happened in this room today. He'd need to be available for most of it. There were things to coordinate, people to contact, the careful machinery of implementation that had to start running now rather than later. But first he stood in the chamber and looked at the broken wall and thought about Voldemort's face when the killing curse stopped. The involuntary thing that had crossed it. The recalculation. The something filed away. Voldemort would come back with a different approach. He was too intelligent not to. He'd understood today that raw power wasn't the differential between them that he'd assumed, and he'd adjust his strategy accordingly. That made him more dangerous, not less. But Harry had something now that he hadn't had before this morning, beyond the political victories and the war powers activation. He had proof, visceral, demonstrated, witnessed proof, that Voldemort could be stopped. Not because Harry was invincible or the confrontation was predetermined, but because the specific nature of Tom Riddle's power had a specific nature of weakness, and Harry had just found one of its edges. He understood the shape of the fight now, in a way he hadn't before. That was worth more than the political framework and the 44 votes and all of it combined. He picked up his papers. He walked out of the chamber. The ministry's corridor outside was busy and louder than normal, and nobody stopped moving when he came through the door, because there was too much to do for anyone to stop, and that was exactly right. The rain had stopped. Somewhere above the ministry's enchanted ceiling, the actual sky was clearing. He had work to do. Chapter 6, What remains 3 weeks after the Wizengamot session, the ministry looked different. Not physically. The atrium fountains were the same, the moving ceiling still showed its curated sky, the lift still announced floors in the same disembodied voice. But the atmosphere had changed in the way that atmospheres change when the people moving through a space have different information than they had before. The ministry workers walked slightly differently. The conversations at the lifts had a different quality. The notice boards, which had previously carried a careful balance of ministry-approved reassurances and oblique acknowledgments of things everyone already knew, now carried actual information, or deployment updates, or powers protocol briefings, a formal notice of the Foundational Review Commission's first public hearing. Fudge's resignation had created a brief administrative chaos that resolved itself within 48 hours into the appointment of an interim minister, a career bureaucrat named Millicent Bagnall's nephew, which was nobody's ideal but was competent and clean, which was what the situation required. The real question of permanent leadership was going to wait for the formal election process that the endorsement framework had introduced, and that process would take 3 months, and in those 3 months the actual governing was being done by a functional coalition of Amelia Bones, Arthur Weasley in a newly created role that Harry had specifically written into the reform documents, and the Foundational Review Commission operating in its oversight capacity. It wasn't elegant. It was the functional mess of genuine institutional change, which is always less clean than the theory of institutional change, and Harry had stopped expecting clean approximately 8 days into the implementation process. He was sitting in the Slytherin seat, not the ancestral manor, the actual Wizengamot seat, on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks out, reviewing the Commission's initial report on legislative validity. It was 412 pages long, and Rosier had written the executive summary personally, which was 40 pages itself, and Harry was on page 30 of the summary and had been for 40 minutes because page 17 had contained a finding that required him to stop and think carefully. The finding was this: 6 of the current Azkaban convictions from the First War had procedural irregularities severe enough that the reformed judicial process would likely require their review. 4 of those 6 were Death Eater convictions. 2 of them were convictions for crimes committed under verified imperius. He'd been sitting with that on page 17 for a while. Hermione knocked and came in. They'd been using a small conference room off the Wizengamot level as a working space for the past 2 weeks, which had been efficient and had the advantage of not requiring them to keep traveling to Grimmauld Place for every conversation, and set a cup of tea on the table beside him with the accuracy of someone who has learned exactly where he puts his hand when he's reading. "You're on page 17, she said. "Have been for 40 minutes. The imperius convictions." She sat down across from him. "I read them last night. 2 people in Azkaban who were under genuine imperius when they committed their crimes," Harry said. "Not the Malfoy kind of imperius, the real kind. One of them was a ministry clerk who'd been under continuous compulsion for 3 years. The other was a 17-year-old boy at the time." "I know. They've been in Azkaban for 14 years. I know that too." Hermione folded her hands on the table. "The reformed judicial process will catch this. That's why you built the review mechanism. The review mechanism takes time." "Yes." She looked at him steadily. "You can't go faster than the process allows without making the process worth less than it costs. You know that." He did know that. He'd said it himself, in almost those exact words, to Neville when they discussed the Longbottom petition. The value of building a legitimate system was that it operated by its own rules rather than by the preferences of whoever was holding power at a given moment. The moment Harry started bending that system's rules because the outcome was good, he was building something that future bad actors could bend for bad outcomes. He turned to page 18. "All right," he said. "Move on." The daily rhythm of the implementation had a texture that nothing in Harry's previous life had prepared him for, which was something he thought about occasionally with a kind of detached bemusement. Fighting a basilisk at 12, a dragon at 14, Voldemort in a graveyard at 14, those things had required courage and quick thinking and a significant amount of luck, and they'd left marks, but they were events. Discreet and violent and over. This was not over. It was continuous and it required a different kind of energy, the sustained, careful, unglamorous energy of people doing work that matters in rooms rather than in fields, making decisions that compound over time into structures that will outlast everyone in the room. He was 16 years old and he was doing this, and sometimes he looked around at the people in the room with him, Hermione with her 40-page executive summaries, Amelia with her monocle and her 30 years of accumulated institutional knowledge, Rosier who'd been waiting 40 years to be useful, Arthur Weasley who turned out to be formidably good at navigating the human machinery of institutional change, and thought, "I built this. Not alone, not even primarily, but I started it and I held the shape of it and it's real." That thought didn't make him proud exactly. It made him feel the weight of it more precisely. Neville came by the commission offices on the 4th Thursday of implementation with a letter from St. Mungo's. He put it on the table in front of Harry without speaking, and Harry looked at it without touching it for a moment. The letter was from the head of the long-term ward. It was brief and precise in the medical way, not warm, but kind in the way that people who work in difficult wards sometimes develop, a kindness that presents as neutrality because the warmth version of it is too costly to maintain. It said that Frank Longbottom had spoken that morning. 6 words. Unprompted, clear, and directed at the healer who'd been treating him for 9 years. The 6 words were, "Tell Neville I'm proud of him." Harry read the letter. "Read it again." "Put it back on the table." Neville was looking at the window. His jaw was working slightly with the effort of keeping his face in order. He was mostly succeeding. "Neville," Harry said. "Don't," Neville said. Not harshly. Just the word of someone who knows that what they're feeling is real and that having it named will make it harder to hold. "I just wanted you to know." "I'm glad he knows," Harry said. Because that was true and it was the right thing, and sometimes the right thing was simple. Neville nodded. He picked the letter back up, folded it carefully, put it in his breast pocket, directly over his heart, Harry noticed, the same place he'd put the small girl's drawing, and sat down at the table and picked up the section of the commission report he'd been assigned to review. He worked through it for 3 hours without stopping, making clean and thorough notes in the margin, and nobody said anything else about the letter, and that was right too. The thing with Draco happened at the beginning of week 4. He came through the flue at Grimmauld Place at 10 in the morning on a Wednesday, which was different from the late-night arrivals that had characterized his previous visits. Coming in daylight meant something deliberate, a different level of commitment to the act. He was dressed in Malfoy robes that were slightly too formal for the hour, which Harry read as armor. He stood in the drawing room and looked at Harry across the table with the expression of someone who has made a decision that cost them something and is presenting the cost without flinching. "I want to formally testify before the Accountability Commission," he said. "About what I know. About what I've been part of." He paused. "Everything." Harry looked at him for a long moment. "Draco. Once you do that, I know what it means." His voice was flat and certain. "I know what it means for my family's name. I know what it means for my father's case." He paused. "My father made choices. He made them for a long time and consistently, and I spent 16 years being taught to admire those choices." Something moved in his expression, something that had clearly been moving for weeks and had finally reached the surface. "Theodore Nott was my friend. He didn't make choices. He was born into the same thing I was, and he wasn't fast enough or lucky enough to find the door out." He looked at Harry. "I want to find the door out." "You already found it," Harry said quietly. "You walked through it the first time you sent me that owl." Draco looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone who wasn't used to having their actions read that clearly and wasn't sure whether to be grateful or unsettled. He landed on something that was tentatively both. "I want the testimony formal. Legal. Documented by Gringotts. I'll set it up today. And I want," he stopped. "Started again. My mother. She's still in that house. I need her out before I testify, because the moment the testimony is documented he'll know, and if she's still there, we'll get her out," Harry said. "Before the testimony. I'll talk to Dumbledore today." Draco was quiet. He looked at the table, then at the rings, then at the drawing room around him, at the working normalcy of it, the papers and tea mugs and the distinct feeling of people building something rather than defending something. He looked like someone who'd been standing in the cold for a long time and has just stepped inside and isn't quite sure he's allowed to acknowledge the warmth. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. Not confrontationally. Genuinely. Harry thought about how to answer it honestly. "Because you told me the truth when you didn't have to," he said. "And because what you're doing now is hard, and hard things done for the right reasons deserve support." Draco looked at him for a long moment. "I've been an absolute, yes," Harry agreed. "And you're just, there's a war on," Harry said. "I'd rather have you making good choices than spend energy holding your bad ones against you." Draco made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was in its family. He looked away. "Gryffindor," he muttered, and the word had lost its sneer, it was just a description, neutrally delivered. "Slytherin," Harry returned, in exactly the same tone. Something between them settled. Not a friendship, not exactly, that was a longer road and they both knew it. But something that had a foundation. Getting Narcissa Malfoy out of the manor took 4 days. The operation involved Dumbledore, 2 senior Aurors, a Gringotts ward specialist, and a piece of misdirection that Lupin devised using the truth compulsion ward properties of Grimmauld Place to create a safe house that Voldemort's surveillance magic couldn't penetrate. She arrived at the house on a Thursday evening with one bag and the particular composure of someone who has been maintaining composure under extreme duress for months and is only now, in a genuinely safe space, allowing any of it to show. She looked at Harry and said, "Draco told me about you. About what you've been doing for him." "He's been doing it himself," Harry said. She studied him with gray eyes that were Draco's eyes and had the specific quality of someone measuring the difference between what they've been told and what they're seeing. "You're not what I expected," she said. "Nobody ever is," he said. "Mrs. Malfoy, this house is safe. You're welcome here for as long as you need." She looked around the hall of Grimmauld Place, the old black family home, her family's home, changed now into something that was neither monument nor embarrassment but just a house where work was being done, and something in her expression moved toward a complicated, careful relief. "My sister destroyed this family," she said, with a precision that made clear she meant Bellatrix rather than Andromeda. "And my husband helped." She paused. "I didn't stop either of them." "No," Harry said. "Not kindly or unkindly. Just honestly." She looked at him. "I'm not asking for absolution." "Good," he said. "I'm not offering it. But I think you already know what you can do instead." She understood him. He could see that she did. Draco's testimony was documented by Gringotts on a Friday morning, 3 days before the Commission's first formal public hearing. He sat across from Ragnok and 2 goblin legal witnesses and a Wizengamot clerk and spoke for 4 hours in the flat, precise voice of someone who has decided that the only way to do this thing is to do it completely. Harry sat in the room as the documenting authority. He said nothing during the testimony. He watched Draco, watched the cost of each disclosure register and be managed and register again, the specific kind of courage that wasn't dramatic but was real and enormous, and kept his face neutral and steady because that was what the moment asked for. When it was done, Ragnok sealed the documentation and stamped it with the Gringotts authentication mark, and Draco sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a long moment and breathed. "How long before he knows?" Draco asked. "He probably already suspects," Harry said. "The manor wards would have registered your mother's departure. He knows something changed." He paused. "The testimony gives him confirmation, but by then your mother is here, the documentation is certified, and you're under the protection of both this house's wards and the Wizengamot's formal witness protection provisions. Which you built into the framework specifically." "I built a lot of things specifically," Harry said. Draco looked at him sideways. "You planned for this." "I planned for the possibility. I didn't know if you'd come through." "I almost didn't." He was quiet for a moment. 3 times I almost didn't." "I know," Harry said. "You came through anyway." They sat in silence for a moment in the Gringotts chamber, and the certified testimony sat on the table between them like a stone that had been removed from somewhere it had been pressing for a long time. "What happens to me now?" Draco asked. Not anxiously, with the practical interest of someone taking stock of a new landscape. "That depends on you," Harry said. "The testimony gives you protected status. Your cooperation with the Commission is documented. Your future is, genuinely open, which I suspect feels very strange." Draco laughed at this, a short and genuine sound. "Extremely strange," he said. "Good strange, though." He considered. "Ask me in a year." The public accountability hearing happened on a Monday, 3 weeks and 6 days after the Wizengamot endorsement session. The chamber was the same chamber, the broken wall repaired, the stone patched with something that didn't quite match the original and therefore read as a deliberate choice rather than an attempt at concealment, which Harry had requested specifically, but the energy was entirely different from either of the previous sessions. The hearing was open. That was the difference. Open to observers, to journalists, to any witch or wizard who chose to attend, with overflow seating in 2 adjacent halls connected by extendable communication enchantments. Every seat was full before 8 in the morning. The overflow halls were full by 9. The hearing was about the past. Not the distant past of Merlin and ancient protocols, the recent past, the specific past of decisions made in this chamber and offices adjacent to it over the past 20 years, decisions that had consequences for real people who were asked to speak about those consequences. Amelia chaired it. Harry sat in the Emery's seat not as an interrogator but as an anchor, the endorsement mechanism, the guarantee that whatever emerged from the hearing had formal legal standing. The first person to testify was a former Auror named Catherine Avery, who had filed 17 reports about Death Eater activity between 1981 and 1985, none of which had resulted in formal investigation, 3 of which had been formally filed as resolved, without any action having been taken. She had a folder with copies of every report, which she'd kept. She placed the folder on the table in front of Amelia and said, very quietly, "I kept them because I thought someday someone might want to know." The hearing room was absolutely silent. The second person was a Muggle-born wizard named Marcus Fenn, who'd been wrongly registered as having used dark magic in 1983 and had spent 4 years in legal proceedings that had never been fully resolved and had cost him his position, his home, and his relationship with his family. The registration had been entered by a ministry clerk who was now identified as one of the compromised officials from Draco's intelligence. The third person was a woman named Arabella Pemberton, who worked in St. Mungo's long-term ward and had been treating Frank and Alice Longbottom since 1982. She didn't speak about medical information, patient confidentiality held regardless of the hearing. She spoke about what it was like to be a healer in a ward full of people who were there because of choices made in rooms like this one, and to send reports to the ministry about their condition for 14 years, and to never receive a single response. The hearing ran for 9 hours. 23 people testified. Amelia asked questions with the precision of someone who has been waiting her entire career to ask them. The journalists in the room wrote very fast. Harry listened to all of it. He didn't perform listening, he actually listened, because every person in that room had come here at a cost and deserved to be genuinely heard rather than strategically catalogued. At several points it was difficult to listen. He let it be difficult and kept listening anyway. At the end of the hearing, Amelia looked at Harry. He stood. He looked at the room, the packed gallery, the journalists, the people who had testified, the Wizengamot members in their seats who had spent 9 hours sitting with the specific discomfort of institutional accountability landing in the room where the institution lived. "The Commission will publish its findings within 30 days, he said. Those findings will form the basis of formal referrals to the independent judiciary for any cases where the evidence supports criminal accountability." He paused. "I want to say something clearly. This hearing was not about punishment for its own sake. It was about the record. About the official, documented, unambiguous record of what happened and what it cost." He looked around the room. "That record exists now. It cannot be removed from the archive, it cannot be buried in a filing system, it cannot be declared politically inconvenient. It happened, it is documented, and it will remain." He paused. The same people who ignored 17 filed reports, who left the Longbottoms in a ward for 14 years without a response, who chose comfortable politics over honest governance, those people are going to be asked to answer for that. Not through retaliation. Through accountability. Through the proper, legitimate, transparent process that we have spent the past month building specifically so that this kind of reckoning can happen with integrity. He looked at the room. That is what this chamber should have always been. That is what it will be from now on. He sat back down. The room was quiet for a moment. Then the gallery began, slowly, to applaud. Not the performed applause of a political event, something more careful and real, the sound of people who have spent a long time being afraid of the institution they were just sitting in and are, for the first time, not afraid of it. Harry didn't stand up for it. He sat in the Emery's seat and let the sound move around him and looked at his hands, at the 4 rings, warm and certain in his, and thought about everything that had led from that Tuesday morning at Gringotts to here, about the people who'd been in every room along the way, about what had been built and what still needed building. Voldemort was still out there. That conversation wasn't finished, Harry had been under no illusion that it was. The war was still the war, and the structures he'd built were structures for a society that needed to be worth fighting for, not a replacement for the fight itself. Everything still coming was real and dangerous and not yet done. But the foundation was real. He could feel that in the specific way he felt anything that was true, not as a thought but as a physical certainty, the same way he felt the rings. He found Hermione in the corridor outside the hearing room afterward, and she looked at him with bright eyes and the very controlled expression of someone who has been managing a large amount of emotion throughout a 9-hour proceeding and is now allowing herself a moment of genuine release. "You know this is just the beginning," she said. "I know. Voldemort. The trial reviews. The 3 months until the ministerial election. The implementation of the judicial framework. The Hogwarts governance restoration." She said these things not as burdens but as a list, her natural way of processing reality. "There's so much left." "I know," Harry said again. "But we built the thing that lets us do all of it." He looked at her. "You did. You built most of the legal framework." "We built it," she said firmly. "We built it," he agreed. Ron appeared from the gallery, having apparently spent the 9-hour hearing in the overflow room where he'd been watching the extended coverage with the particular combination of attention and horror that Ron brought to things that required him to sit still for extended periods. He looked at Harry with an expression that was simpler and more fundamental than anything that needed analysis. "You all right?" he asked. "Yeah," Harry said. And meant it in the full, non-automatic way that the word sometimes carried, not a social response but an honest assessment. He was tired. He was more tired than he'd been after any of the dramatic things that had happened in the past month. But underneath the tired was something that felt like bedrock, solid and real and genuinely his. He was all right. In a way he hadn't been all right in, possibly ever. "Good," Ron said. "Because Mum's made dinner and she said if you don't come tonight she's coming to find you, and I think we've all seen enough ministry drama for one day." Harry laughed. A real one, quick and genuine, and it startled him slightly because it had been a while since laughter had come that naturally and that fast. "Tell her I'll be there," he said. Luna found him on the way out, as she often did at the moments that mattered, materializing from somewhere as though she'd been there all along and he'd simply not noticed until now. She fell into step beside him through the ministry corridor with her serene, unhurried pace. "It's good work," she said. "Not you did good work, just the simpler thing, the statement of quality about the thing itself." "There's more to do," he said. "Yes. There always is." She tilted her head. "But the thing about good work is that it tends to keep getting done once you've started it. Good structures keep standing once you've built them properly." She paused. "Your father's name is in those walls now, you know. And your mother's. All 4 of them." Harry thought about that. Lily Evans, who hadn't known her own magical lineage and had loved a boy from an ancient family and had died protecting their son. James Potter, who'd descended from brothers who'd sought to bargain with death and had understood, at the end, that you couldn't bargain with it, only face it. Sirius, who'd been a brother in everything but blood and had died in a room full of old magic and never seen any of this. And Merlin, who'd built his protocols for someone he'd never meet and trusted that they'd use them correctly. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I suppose they are." He was almost at the atrium when he felt it, the particular quality of the Peverell awareness that had been developing over the past weeks, the peripheral sense of something moving at the edges of the magical world. He stopped. It wasn't Voldemort. It was something smaller and more specific, a magical signature he recognized because he'd been learning to recognize it, carefully and deliberately, for the past 10 days. The Elder Wand. It was closer than it had been. Moving toward him, or toward wherever Dumbledore was, which was likely the same place. Harry had been thinking about the wand's allegiance for the past 3 weeks, had been thinking about it in the quiet hours when the commission work was done and the house was settled, turning the theory over and examining it from different angles with the Peverell understanding that had been clarifying steadily since the rings. He understood it now in a way he hadn't before the Wizengamot session. The wand's allegiance wasn't about conquest or ownership. It was about recognition, about the wand acknowledging who was, in the deepest magical sense, its rightful heir. And the rightful heir of the Peverell line, of all 3 brothers' lines, converging, was the person whose relationship with death was most complete. Not fearless. Not invulnerable. Complete. Understood. He'd faced the killing curse in the chamber and turned it away not through superior power but through something more fundamental, an understanding of what the curse was and what it couldn't do to someone who had fully accepted the truth about mortality. He'd grown up with death following him, his parents at a year old, Cedric in a graveyard, Sirius through a veil, and he'd spent most of his life being defined by those losses, being shaped by them, sometimes crushed by them. But somewhere between Gringotts and the chamber, something had finished settling. He carried his dead with him as weight that was real and permanent in his, not as wounds that needed managing. That was the completion. The thing the wand recognized. Dumbledore was in the atrium, waiting for him. Not the comfortable, slightly theatrical waiting of their previous conversations, just standing, with his hands at his sides and the elder wand visible for the first time, held loosely and without ceremony. Harry looked at it. It looked back at him, in the specific way that wands did when they were paying attention. "You felt it," Dumbledore said. "You felt it too." "I've felt it since the chamber," Dumbledore said. "Since you stopped the curse." He looked at the wand in his hand. "I've been carrying this wand for 50 years and I have always known it was mine conditionally. That it was waiting." He looked at Harry. "I didn't know what it was waiting for." "The bloodline convergence," Harry said. "All three brothers. The Death Hallows acknowledge the heir not through combat but through recognition." "And you're recognized?" "Yes." Dumbledore looked at the wand for a long moment. Then he held it out, handle first, in the simple way of someone passing something that belongs to someone else. Harry took it. The moment his hand closed around it, the magic was, not what he expected. Not a surge or a blazing or any of the dramatic things that extremely significant magical objects were supposed to do in stories. It was a recognition, deep and quiet and certain, the specific feeling of something that has been looking for its correct position in the world and has found it. The wand was warm and slightly vibrating with attention, the way a very well-made instrument sounds when it's being held by someone who knows how to use it. He stood in the ministry atrium with the elder wand in his right hand and the 4 rings on his right hand beside it, and the cloak somewhere in his robes, and the stone gone into the earth of the forbidden forest where it belonged, and understood that this was not an ending. It was barely even a beginning. Voldemort knew what Harry had now. Would be planning accordingly, with that terrible intelligence turned toward the specific problem of someone who had become more than he'd anticipated. The war was going to enter a different phase, harder and stranger and more dangerous, probably, than the straightforward confrontations that had come before, because Voldemort understood now that force alone wasn't going to resolve this. The political work was ongoing. The judicial review. The ministerial election. The 1,000 details of making the framework function in practice rather than just in principle. The people around him who needed support and resources and attention and the specific kinds of help that mattered to each of them. All of it was still there. All of it still required doing. But he stood in the atrium for a moment before the next thing started, because some moments deserved to be stood in rather than moved through immediately, and let himself feel the sum of the past weeks. The reading at Gringotts. The kitchen at Grimmauld Place and everyone who'd sat around the table. Neville on the chamber floor speaking about his parents with a steadiness that had cost him everything and given him more back. Draco through the flue at 10 in the morning, making his choice in daylight. Hermione's 47 pages and her highlighter and her absolute refusal to let anything be less thorough than it needed to be. Ron making toast in silence because he understood when silence was the right thing. Luna being precisely, continuously, correctly herself. His mother's lineage on the wall at Gringotts in ancient light. His father's line running through the Peverell rings to the wand in his hand. Serious, always serious, the warm and furious and generous person who had deserved everything he hadn't gotten and whom Harry was going to carry always. The small girl's drawing, folded over his heart. He breathed in the ministry's enchanted air and looked at the moving ceiling above the atrium, clear blue, the curated sky, and for once the gap between the fiction of it and the reality outside didn't bother him. He'd go outside in a minute. Walk in the actual weather under the actual sky. He had people to see. Work to do. A war to finish, on his own terms, in his own way, as himself rather than as anyone's instrument or symbol or sacrifice. Dumbledore stood beside him, and they were quiet for a moment, the two of them, the old man and the 16-year-old, the architect and the heir, the careful planner who had kept too many secrets for too long and the boy who had inherited the consequences and turned them into something else entirely. "What happens now?" Dumbledore asked. Harry looked at him. Looked at the chamber corridor behind them, at the ministry workers moving around them, at the atrium full of ordinary extraordinary people going about the work of their lives. "We finish it," he said. "Properly this time. All of us together." He pocketed the elder wand, it settled into his robes with the ease of something that had always been meant to be there, and walked toward the exit. The doors opened onto the street. The sky outside was wide and clear and the light was the particular gold of a late afternoon in late summer, and London was going about its business around the concealed entrance to a world that had just changed significantly and was still in the process of understanding what that change meant and what it required. Harry stood on the pavement for a moment, the way he'd stood on the steps of Gringotts on that Tuesday that now felt like it had happened to a different person and yet felt like yesterday. Then he walked into it. Forward, because forward was the only direction that mattered. Into the work and the difficulty and the people and the possibility of things being genuinely, properly better than they had been. The rings were worn. The wand was quiet and attentive in his pocket. The afternoon light was very clear. Harry Potter, Lord of the Houses of Gryffindor, Slytherin, Peverell, and Emrys, walked into the street and disappeared into the city, and above him the sky was enormous and open and entirely, genuinely his.